Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 22nd meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2020. The meeting is being held virtually. The first item on our agenda today is a decision to take agenda item 4 in private. Are we agreed? We take that as agreement. The second item on our agenda is the consideration of continued petitions. And can I welcome Rhoda Grant, who will be attending for this petition. The first continued petition for consideration is Petition 1723, Essential Tremor Treatment in Scotland, lodged by Mary Ramsey. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to raise awareness of essential tremor and to support the introduction and use of a focus ultrasound scanner for treating people in Scotland who have this condition. The committee will take evidence from Professor Dipankar Nandi, Consultant Neurosurgeon and Head of Department, Charing Cross Hospital and St Mary's Hospital, and Professor at Imperial College London. And can I welcome the Professor today and thank him very much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy and important schedule to provide evidence. And we're going to move straight to questions, Professor. If you can hear us?
Yes, please. Yes, sorry. Good morning.
Okay, thank you. That's grand. Thank you. So the petition asks the Scottish Government to support the introduction and use of a focus ultrasound scanner for treating people in Scotland who have essential tremor. Can I ask, as a surgeon who carries out this type of surgery for NHS England, do you agree with this suggestion?
The short answer is yes. It's the numbers are tremor is the commonest involuntary movement disorder. It gets more frequent with age. So if you take a cutoff of 40, up to 4% of people over the age of 40 would have some kind of significant tremor. When you get to the age of 60 plus, it's a sizable number, nearly 8%. And the vast majority of these patients will not really respond reliably to any medical treatment, any drug therapy. So you're left with a fair number of people who, and it mainly affects the hands, fortunately, so they are left with having to give up work-related stuff or leisure activities or get very withdrawn socially because of a very dominant, obvious tremor. It's not just embarrassment, but also actually affects day-to-day activities, so writing, using a computer keyboard, mobile phone, drinking, using cutlery.
Thank you. Can I ask if there are specific situations where this wouldn't be the best treatment?
Yes, I wouldn't advocate. It's an operation. It's a brain lesion, it's a surgery. So I wouldn't advocate doing this willy-nilly. So all patients who go through this kind of intervention go through a program of being assessed, reviewed, and treated by neurologists who specialize in this kind of condition. Many have workarounds to get on with their normal lives, with albeit some compromises. But when you reach a situation where a person, it's clearly impacting on their quality of life, on their mental health, and sometimes in the younger age groups on their employment, and they have failed adequate medical treatment for a certain number of years, and they're otherwise well, then I think that is the kind of cohort of patients, which would be very small overall, but where this kind of therapy would be life-changing.
And you might not know this, but I wonder if you have an estimate for how many people in Scotland you think would require this treatment?
I'm assuming the population of Scotland is about 5 million.
6 million, yeah.
So it's, if you say 10% of that, so about 600,000 will have tremor of some sort by the time they hit the age of 60. So divide that, something like 100,000 people. Of that, I would say 10% people with significant tremor would be people who would benefit from this. So about 10,000 in a given time.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Can I call Gail Ross?
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I think that's a much higher number than we'd anticipated. So thanks for that. So you carry out MR guided focus ultrasound in England, and you've given a little bit of an outline to the convener about when it would happen. So how many years after trying other interventions would you say from maybe the first appointment would you then recommend to carry out this procedure? And does it come, well, it obviously comes with risk, but I suppose in this case the benefits would massively outweigh the risk. Would you agree with that?
So, sorry, I missed the last bit, but if you reach a point where someone would, of their own accord, feel that their quality of life is heavily compromised by the tremor, and they would consider treatment, I would say the first choice in terms of intervention, there are other surgical modalities available. There's something which I do regularly called deep brain stimulation. And also, in many ways, this treatment is nothing new, actually. The technology and the science behind making a lesion in a particular part of the thalamus is over 50, 60 years old. It predates MRI or CT scans. So it's a very established principle clinically, scientifically, that it works. It's fairly innocuous. What this focused ultrasound has done is actually taken the level of safety to a new playing field. So rather than making a hole in the head and putting a probe inside, either to just make a lesion in a one-off or to put permanent electrodes in with the accessories, the wires, the battery. This one is a one-off where you don't actually make any incision into the brain. There is nothing which grows into the brain space. So it is, as far as brain surgery goes, the safest kind of situation I can think of. It doesn't involve ionizing radiation like gamma knife or X-rays. So the safety profile is probably its biggest advantage compared to where we are otherwise. It also opens the door for treatment of some patients who unfortunately we have had no answer for. People in their 70s and 80s, people with serious medical conditions, who one would not contemplate doing deep brain stimulation in. So they have been left pretty much to fend for themselves. So that is the kind of patient I'm talking mostly about. In a younger person with something, other condition can cause tremor, Parkinson's is a very common example. There I would say this treatment is probably not the first choice. DBS, deep brain stimulation, is definitely superior because it is adjustable, it moves with the disease, and it affords a lot of other options apart from treating the tremor. So this is specifically for patients who have the dominant hand not working properly because of the shakes, who feel that they're restrained in their quality of life socially in doing things. It's a very, as I say, as safe as it gets option, which is a one-off. There is no follow-up, and it can be done as an outpatient basis.
Okay. Do you know how many hospitals in England currently carry out this procedure?
At the moment, we are the only one.
Okay. And sorry, on you go.
Sorry, it's just that it's been around in the world for about 6 to 7 years now. The number of centers keeps growing. When we started 4 years ago, we were the 8th center in Europe. Now there are about a dozen. Worldwide, I would say there are about 30 to 35 centers. So it's not very common, but unfortunately, we are the only one in the UK so far.
And I suppose, given the amount of people that we're talking about and the success of the actual procedure, you would like to see that rolled out further. Do you have to have any specific qualifications, or just any neurosurgeon can perform it?
Like most complex and new interventions, this is best done in the setting of a multidisciplinary team. So at the bare minimum, it should be a center which has got, ironically, the surgeon is actually the least important in this. It's the neurologists who are the key. People who can select the right patient, who can make sure that they have been adequately tried with non-invasive drug therapy, etc. So you need that setting. Anywhere that treats people with Parkinson's, with tremor, with MS, that kind of a neurosciences center. And certainly, yes, the surgical setup should be able to offer the whole range, including DBS and lesioning with a probe and this. So, and I can think of, I'm sure Edinburgh has that, and Glasgow, to the best of my knowledge, have the wherewithal.
Okay, and just a final question, Dr. Nandi, thank you. We've been advised that NHS England is consulting on a draft clinical commissioning policy to provide this procedure for up to 150 patients a year, and they're recommending that this is funded as an in-year service development. Do you know of that, the consultation, and do you have any updates at all on that?
Yes, I fortunately do. As of 4 weeks ago, they have authorized it now. So that was the sticking point, and that, I guess, was the reason we are the only unit, because clearly without funding. So they have the Clinical Priorities Advisory Group of the NHS England system. So we went through all the regulatory hoops, but ultimately now it's authorized for 150 patients a year in our unit with the usual governance arrangements. But that's our units. I'm hoping in very soon there'll be other units doing similar kind of thing.
Great news. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, convener.
Thank you. Can I call David Torrance?
Thank you, convener, and good morning, Professor. The Scottish Government has previously advised the committee that in June 2018, NICE published guidelines which concluded that while clinical evidence does not raise safety concerns, current evidence of benefits is limited. Therefore, evidence of patient benefit is too limited for the NHS. However, NICE has advised that guidance represents its views but is not mandatory, and notes that decisions to fund procedures are made at local NHS level, and usually by a case-to-case basis. Do you agree with the Scottish Government's position on why treatment cannot currently be provided?
It is the problem with all new technology. You will never have the numbers to establish the case at the outset. But it is a moving field, and as I alluded to before, the actual procedure, the act of making a precise lesion deep in the brain, in that part of the thalamus, is actually the provenance, the scientific literature proofs are all there, and the literature runs into hundreds of thousands of cases over the decades. All that focused ultrasound has done is made it a whole lot safer to do without incisions, without putting intracranial anything inside the brain. It completely takes away. The risk of infection is zero, essentially. The risk of a bleed is minuscule. These are real risks for patients who undergo this surgery now with deep brain stimulation. They have a 1% risk of a major stroke or death. Likewise, if I do this, I've been doing this procedure for 20 years with putting a probe inside the head and then using that to generate a lesion. All these risks are obviated by this current technology. So I would say if one is to allow people to have lesions, which NHS England and I guess NHS Scotland does, it would be remiss not to offer them this technology, because you're essentially asking people to take on a risk which in the modern day they don't need to.
Thank you, Professor. My final question, convener. NICE guidelines cover Scotland and England. Can you see any reasons why NHS England moved forward with providing this treatment, but NHS Scotland cannot? And in your opinion, what needs to happen for this treatment to be provided by NHS Scotland?
I'm sorry, Torrance, I missed the last bit of your sentence.
In your opinion, what needs to happen for this treatment to be provided by NHS Scotland?
It's a capital-intensive thing. The machine itself is expensive. The running costs are very small. There are no hardware implantables to consider. And Scotland, to the best of my knowledge, has two very eminent neurosciences centers which have the personnel who can deal with this. So I guess all it needs is to fund the buying of the machine, either in Edinburgh or in Glasgow. One machine should suffice for the entire Scottish population.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I call Maurice Corey?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Dr. Nandy. Can I just say that the Scottish Government has also stated that the National Specialist Services Committee was clear that should the evidence base be further developed and MR-guided focused ultrasound be recognised as safe and effective intervention for the treatment of tremor, it's obviously seen this has probably now been followed by the opening in London, your organisation, your clinic, 4 weeks ago. Would you agree that further evidence on the safety and efficacy of MRG FUS is required?
I think I can confidently and comfortably state that ship has sailed. So this has now got FDA approval as of 5 years ago. This has got Council of Europe approval. Clinically, in terms of safety profile, it actually is a whole lot safer than the current gold standard of treatment, deep brain stimulation. In terms of efficacy, again, the actual surgery, the thalamotomy, causing of a lesion in the thalamus to control tremor, there is more literature for that than for surgery for cancer. So scientifically, I think there's little to establish. The only bone of contention may well be cost effectiveness, but I could point you to the fact that every time I put in a DBS device, the implant costs alone are £40,000. This one has no implants. There are no consumables to speak of. So there's an upfront capital cost of buying the machine. But thereafter, it is actually, and there are studies, peer-reviewed publications, which have looked at the cost effectiveness of DBS versus this. And again, once you reach 20 patients, you recoup the cost of the machine.
Right. Thank you for that. That's very interesting. And are you involved at all with any clinicians at NHS Tayside in Scotland in relation to the acquisition of equipment and its installation? Have you been called on to advise on that, sir?
Is this the one in Dundee?
Yes, Dundee. Sorry, beg your pardon, Dundee. Yeah.
Sorry. No, yes. For a couple of years, I think the University of Dundee was trying to acquire a machine, and they managed to get charitable funding. In fact, they were going to start early this year. The pandemic put paid to those plans. Mm-hmm. But yes, I'm aware of that, and I've met their neurosurgeon and their neurologist. I also get the impression that they have a broader interest, including for work in brain tumors. But yes, I'm aware of that to that extent.
And finally, Convener, Dr. Nandy, have there been any sort of thoughts about the clinical trials in Scotland itself in relation to this procedure?
Not to my knowledge, but I think with all such interventions in newer technology and new small numbers of patients, trials are best done in a multi-centric, multinational kind of background. So the couple of trials that we have been involved in, we were involved in multinational trials for tremor way back in 2016, which lasted for 2 years, and that involved 22 centers across the world. And currently we are leading a trial for Parkinson's disease, a subset of Parkinson's. Again, it's 6 centers. So any unit which starts in Scotland, I'm sure they will be happy to, and we'll be more than happy to join hands in multicentric trials. I think the numbers are going to be too small for a single unit to launch a trial.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nandy. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I call Tom Mason?
Thank you, Convener. Professor Nandy, 2 questions. First of all, is there to do with the current situation? It may be some time before a Scottish unit really gets up and going. Is there any reason at all why patients from Scotland shouldn't be come down to your unit or some other units in England in the meantime? Is there any barrier against that?
Well, the short answer is no. But I would point out at the moment we are the only unit, and we have a waiting list of patients who have been referred to us, who we have seen, assessed, and just the ones which we feel are eligible and very suitable for this treatment. That list runs into about 300 odd patients. So it is going to take time, whichever way one looks at it. The other thing, of course, is developing expertise and the service as a whole. I think it would be attractive for neuroscientists and neurosurgeons in Scotland to have a centre where they can then progress the field.
Thank you. Just a matter of interest, how much is the capital cost of a machine, whatever?
I'm putting out a broad figure. I'm sure these are open to negotiations with the company. About 2.5 million euros for the entire setup.
Okay, right. Okay, can I explore a bit further? I have a vested interest here because I'm a Parkinson's sufferer, whatever. But interestingly, I was diagnosed as essential tremor initially, and after about 2 years, they decided I had Parkinson's. Can you describe really what the interface is correctly between essential tremor and Parkinson's, and how many people who are actually sitting there with essential tremor actually have Parkinson's? And are Parkinson's sufferers this treatment available to them? I mean, I don't need it because I'm on medication that seems to work quite well. Although it makes my breakfast somewhat entertaining, downing pills in the morning. But could you expand and elaborate around the whole issue of the Parkinson essential tremor divide?
Yes, of course, Mr. Mason, and thank you for the opportunity, because I've kept myself to tremor because this is the only FDA and CE approved indication. But you are right. Parkinson's disease is the most commonly recognized condition where tremor happens. Now, essential tremor, the numbers are about something like 8 to 10 times number of people with that compared to Parkinson's. It is very common to diagnose one for the other and vice versa. In time, in the hands of a good neurologist, it's easy enough to settle the diagnosis. One never crosses over to the other. Someone with essential tremor does not actually get Parkinson's necessarily, and the other way around as well. But there are some fine differences of the kind of tremor, but the way the treatment works is almost like a final common pathway. So lesioning will work very well in Parkinson's too, as long as it is to control particular symptoms. So there is definitely a role for this technology to be used in patients with Parkinson's who are in particular suffering a lot from tremor, sometimes even with dyskinesias when they have to take a lot of medication and they have side effects to those medications. That causes a lot of involuntary movements. Now, it is entirely safe, and we are not currently part of a trial internationally doing this, but there have been trials with lesioning by other means, with physical intracranial probes, where it's beyond doubt has been established that lesioning has a very important role to play in Parkinson's, over and above DBS. It would be something which, again, I would say should be practiced in the aegis of a neurosciences center which specializes in movement disorders. But that is a definite application which I'm sure in time to come more and more patients will avail of. People with Parkinson's in their 70s and 80s currently have zero recourse to any surgical treatment when medication fails. So this is one option. There are other things as well. There are things like mood disorders, anywhere where lesioning has been tried in the past successfully. But I would not class them in the same situation as tremor, because the knowledge we have of what causes these conditions is much less apparent. They need a lot more research, but it is possible. It is certainly possible for very severe pain conditions, cancer pain, other kinds of intractable pain. So there is a whole host of neurological conditions where this could be useful. And the other half of it is the same technology of using ultrasound waves to make changes in the brain could be an important part of chemotherapy for brain cancers. And that's what the Dundee group want to look at in further depth. But that's, again, a possibility. So this is not a one-trick pony, as it were. All this technology does is accurately delivers controlled amounts of sound energy to a very precise part of the brain. And, the applications really are down to us as clinicians and neuroscientists to apply.
Thank you. I mean, from what I hear from you, the acquisition of suitable equipment for this is almost a no-brainer, I would think. Would that be right?
I couldn't agree with you more, but it has taken us 2 years since we started doing the lesions for NICE to approve, and then another 3 years for NHS England to approve the commissioning of the treatment in a setting where they didn't have to pay for the machine. So I can understand there are a lot of demands on the public purse, but this one, I think, definitely is value for money.
Yeah, it seems so. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Rhoda Grant at this point, if she wants to ask a question, and then you also have an opportunity to be part of the discussion in the committee when we think about what we're going to do next with the petition. But if you wanted to ask a question now.
Thank you. I very much would. I think that's fascinating. I've been working with my constituent, Mary Ramsey, on this. This is her petition, and she's been campaigning for some time to bring this technology to Scotland. So I thought I knew a fair amount about it until this morning, and it's been an education. Can I just ask a wee bit about waiting lists? Because you said that you had 300 people on the waiting list, and when we think there could be around 10,000 people that might look at this treatment within Scotland, that seems a tiny percentage of the people that you can treat. How long does it take to treat somebody? You said if 20 patients were treated, then it would obviously recoup the cost of the machine through savings. But how many people could be treated, say, in a day, and how much aftercare is required?
Thank you. And I'm aware that you are spearheading this, and I'm grateful on behalf of Mary Ramsey, who's done an enormous amount. In fact, the machine we have in St. Mary's, we owe it to a nurse who left it as a bequest, who worked in St. Mary's for 30 years, and she then retired and invested very wisely in the US stock exchange, and she left this entire fortune to be used, and which is why we are in the position we are in. To come back to your question, so it can be done as an outpatient. So there is overnight stay is a relative need. So far, I have to admit, we have been doing it with overnight stay for two particular reasons. One was the stipulation of the trial, the clinical trial, which was FDA approved, and they don't like any changes in their stipulation. So we used to keep patients overnight. The other reason, of course, is most of our patients come from outside London. We have patients from Denmark, from Ireland, from Scotland. So we didn't feel it right for them to have to travel home. They are elderly on the day after. But certainly for patients who live locally, now that we are going to start doing NHS patients, we will definitely send them home the same day. The main constraint is the setting up of each individual patient. They have a frame put on under local anesthetic, and then they go into this MRI machine, which is fixed along with the ultrasound machine. And it takes about, nowadays in our hands, 4 to 5 hours, start to finish, of which the time they spend with that frame locked onto their head is about a couple of hours. This is a learning curve. When we started, the first couple of patients took us 8 to 9 hours. So we are getting slick at this, and the whole team is getting good at it, like any other procedure. We can't think of any complications to speak of. Now, how many could we do? It's partly a question of resources, both the hardware. We have a single machine, and remember, we are tying up the MRI scanner when we do this. So that, I think, is an important consideration for NHS Scotland as well. It takes about 4 to 5 hours of an MRI machine while one treatment is being done. But absolutely, starting off in April, when the NHS England funding kicks in, we would hope to do at least 2 a week. And with the service infrastructure personnel coming in, I cannot see a reason why we can't do 1 every working day of the week. So it slightly depends on the people involved, how many can you spare, but the machine can take it. The machine can even take 2 a day. In Switzerland, they have a commercial unit who essentially do international patients, and they do 2 every day. So it's entirely doable.
Okay. It just seems that we are then very short of machines, given the waiting lists and given the need for the technology, that we could do with a lot more machines and people trained to use them to meet the need that is out there.
Yes, I was being deliberately modest because I can well understand the hesitancy of any funding agency because it is taxpayers' money, and I completely respect that. So to say that you should have 10 machines in one go is probably daunting. So when I say 10,000 people might benefit, patient choice is a very interesting thing in this. This is not, in that sense, a cancer or something which... So often, for DBS, I can certainly say that. I've been doing this for 20 years. Patients who are supremely eligible to have deep brain stimulation. It is available on the NHS. It's free, so there's no cost implication. But a third of our patients choose not to go ahead simply because they don't like the idea of somebody making holes in their head, having wires put in for all time. So that is a subset of patients who might well agree to have this done, and some have. But also, even for this technology, there will be a set of patients who may think, well, it is tremor, I'm dealing with it, I would rather not have brain surgery. So the numbers will not come to that kind of number, but certainly I think you're looking at, once the service is up and coming and available, you will see about something like 500 cases a year in Scotland.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Can I call Gail Ross back in?
Thanks, convener. Yeah, I just had a quick supplementary about I suppose the efficacy rate. Does it eliminate tremor 100%, or can you not guarantee that, or does it depend on the individual case?
So I think the fair number to put is up to 90% of patients will have over 80% of their tremor controlled. Nobody gets cured. So this is a control mechanism. And to some degree, the tremor we measure in terms of, there are objective clinical criteria of making spirals or moving your hand, the neurologists do all this. But individual patients also concentrate on what matters to them. So I had one who was a painter, and as long as he could paint afterwards, he couldn't care whether he could drink from a cup or not. Another was a retired Air Force pilot. All he wanted was go out with his friends in the Air Force Club and have a drink without spilling. So, you have to factor that in as to what would constitute success for individual patients. So I would say confidently, up to 90% of patients would be 90% satisfied. So it's not a cure by any means.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we would all agree that has been exceptionally useful and interesting and thought-provoking. We need to think about what we want to do next. One suggestion has been that we would want to reflect on the evidence, but I think we've probably heard quite a lot already that we can act on. My first instinct is we should write to Scottish Government and ask the Cabinet Secretary to respond to the evidence that we've heard. What I might do is I will go around the committee, but if people can be brief, I will call in Rhoda first, obviously because she's in close contact with the petitioner. She may have very specific things that she thinks that we could be usefully doing at this point.
I think a couple of things. Given that this is now going to be available on the NHS in England, and the evidence they have is the same as the evidence that we have, could we write to the Scottish Government and ask that this decision not to make it available on the NHS in Scotland is reviewed in light of that? Because it seems to me that the evidence we've heard this morning, I think, is absolutely overwhelming that we need this technology in Scotland. I think the other thing, and I may be wrong in this, so I would allow those at Dundee to come back if I am. They were obviously fundraising for the technology, and I think they're not there. They're very close to having the funding. I think the sticking point possibly is and was for some time whether or not they would, they need to be able to use the machine. So I think it's really important that we look at this being available on the NHS for Scotland. But there, as Professor Nandy alluded to, I think they're very keen to do some research on other uses for the technology. Some of those technologies obviously have been around for a long time, but to be able to use the machine in that way. So possibly also pursue where the research funding would be available for them to do that work, because I think having this treatment available in Scotland, well, when I listened to Mary Ramsey and her experience, she has to go to Newcastle for her deep brain stimulation. It needs readjustment from time to time, and this treatment's not going to help her because she's already had that. But when you think of a one-off treatment for somebody that is non-invasive, I mean, it's something I think we really need to fight for our patients. So I think to look at the research for other uses for the technology, and also to have it signed off for the NHS in Scotland. I mean, 20 patients and you recoup the cost, and that's probably fewer actually in Scotland if you take into account the cost of sending people cross-border to get this treatment already. So you've got not only the huge cost of the medical intervention, but you also have the cost of travel and subsistence while people and their family are there. So I think we need to push to make sure there's a level playing field for patients in Scotland as there is in England.
Okay, thanks very much, Rhoda. I think if we can maybe get a bit of agreement, and people don't need to come in if they don't feel necessary, I'm just conscious of everybody's time, we would be writing to Scottish Government, to write to Cabinet Secretary, this question of can it be cleared for use in Scotland, the benefits to that, the crossover to other benefits. I mean, I think the Parkinson one is particularly interesting, that they would reflect on that. And it would be interesting a wee bit more of what's happening in Dundee. Can you indicate if there's somebody who wants to come in, if they've got further suggestions what we might do? I'm very conscious of the Professor's time and I don't want to hold on too much longer. I think we're getting agreement on that from everyone. Yes? Yeah, okay. So I think it would be fair to say that as a committee we very much appreciate your time, Professor. We have found it really, really interesting, and we hope that in contact with the Scottish Government, reflecting on the evidence that you've given us, that we can get the kind of progress that you would hope. It makes sense in financial terms, it makes sense in terms of treatment, and it's not often you see it, but I think we've heard such a compelling case this morning, and we would want to make sure that that can be used in order to inform decisions that are going to be made by the Scottish Government and the NHS here. Can I thank you very much for your attendance this morning. It's really been appreciated, and I appreciate how busy your time is, but you managed, I think, to describe in lay terms what is clearly a very important procedure, and I thank you very much for that. I'm going to now suspend briefly. Shall we say, time is it? At 10:15, come back at 10:15 if that's okay?
It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, and I'm going to make it slightly less than that. Shall we say we'll suspend and come back at 10:13? Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I call the meeting back to order, and now we'll move to the next continued petition, which is petition 1651, prescribed drug dependence and withdrawal, lodged by Marion Brown on behalf of Recovery and Renewal. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to take action to recognise appropriately and effectively support individuals affected and harmed by prescribed drug dependence and withdrawal. This is a continued petition lodged in May 2017 and last considered by the committee on 7th March 2019. At that last consideration, the committee agreed to defer further consideration of the petition until after the Short Life Working Group on Prescription Medicine Dependence and Withdrawal had reported its recommendations. The committee has since received 2 submissions from the petitioner. The petitioner advises that the Short Life Working Group recommendations are due for Scottish Government public consultation from December 2020 to January 21. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action, and I'm going to call Gail Ross first.
Thank you, convener. I've got a number of opinions on this petition. I mean, it's not a secret that I've been off and on antidepressants my whole life. And one of the things that the doctor tells you when they prescribe you a new antidepressant is don't come off it immediately. You know, if you're going to come off it, do it in a staged way, or, you know, come back in and see us and we can discuss it. So I'm a bit concerned that there are some, what it seems to be here, and I've read over the whole thing, GPs and health professionals that don't take the drug dependence and withdrawal thing as an actual symptom. I was really surprised at that, because I thought that that was a widely understood issue. I think that it's good that the government are actually taking this seriously by setting up a short life working group now. The recommendations are coming out in January, as you said. I don't know if it's worthwhile us writing to them now if the recommendations, you know, if they're only consulting, if it's only just started in December and we're hoping to get something in January. I think that it would be worthwhile to write to the Cabinet Secretary to highlight the issues that have been raised in the petition and request that they are considered alongside the consultation results. And then maybe once we get a reply back from the Cabinet Secretary, we could also it could also work in that we could see what the consultation results are. But I certainly wouldn't want to just close it, because I think that this is, and you know, as I said, the government have now acknowledged this by setting up a working group. It is a huge issue. So that would be my suggestion, but I'm open, obviously, to hearing other suggestions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I entirely agree with what Gail has bravely said. As you know, Marion Brown is one of my constituents, and we talk from time to time, because I have issues with my veteran side on that portfolio where this comes in. I have a really big concern at the moment is that to do with antidepressants and the question of these being given to patients by the medical profession. And I feel sometimes it's the start of the rocky road downwards if we're not careful. And I think a lot more needs to be done into looking at antidepressants and their role in medication. And therefore, I would be absolutely agree with Gail Ross, my colleague, in writing to the Scottish Government, because I want to see what the results of this short life working group are, because I'm not absolutely certain they're getting to the key or to the bottom of this question of the antidepressants and the whole factors around that, because we've seen an increase in suicides, and also, you know, the people have obviously been involved and having some of this medication. And I think that a lot more needs to be talked about, and maybe look at some of the terms of reference of the short life working group as well. But let's see what the results of that are in January or thereabouts. And also, I think we need to highlight this to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport. Absolutely agree on that one as well, and the issues raised. But I certainly would like more examination done on this question of antidepressants, because I don't believe we're even scratching the surface on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. David Torrance.
Like my colleagues, I'm happy to keep the petition open. I would like to wait and see the results of the short life working group, and I definitely think we should write to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport to highlight the issues raised by the petition. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Tom Mason. And can I apologise for not noticing you want to come back in at the end of the last petition, but I'll call you in this one.
No, that's all right, Convener. No, I mean, I agree with my colleagues. We must, I think, waiting to make sure that what comes out of the working group covers all the bases. And as Morris says, there could well be gaps which need to be filled, but we can assess that once we've got the result of the working group. So keep it open and make sure the government comes back with the information so we can make further decisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Tom. So I think there is an agreement, there is an issue here, and we just want to make sure we're kind of, recognising that by, getting an update on the short life working group and asking that the Cabinet Secretary reflects in the action they're going to take on the evidence that we have and submissions from the petitioner and others. So if that's agreed, we will write to the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary in those terms. We can move now to the next continued petition on our agenda today, which is petition 1662, Improved Treatment for Patients with Lyme Disease and Associated Tick-Borne Diseases, lodged by Janie Cringin and Lorraine Murray on behalf of Tick-Borne Illness Campaign Scotland. And I would want to welcome Alexander Burnett, MSP, for the consideration of this petition. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to improve testing and treatment for Lyme disease and associated tick-borne diseases by ensuring that medical professionals in Scotland are fully equipped to deal with the complexity of tick-borne infections, addressing the lack of reliability of tests, the full variety of species in Scotland, the presence of persister bacteria which are difficult to eradicate, and the complexities caused by the presence of possibly multiple co-infections, and to complement this with a public awareness campaign. The petition was last considered in October 2020, and since that meeting, submissions have been received from the Minister for Health, Sport and Wellbeing, Dr Cruikshank, who was appointed as the Royal College of GPs Clinical Champion for Lyme Disease in 2018, leading the Royal College's Lyme Disease Spotlight Project, Professor Lambert, an infectious disease specialist and clinician in the area of tick-borne infections, who established a Lyme Resource Centre in Scotland in 2019 to address the lack of recognition of the impact that tick-borne infections are having in Scotland, and the petitioners. And their submissions are all summarised in our papers, and again have made very useful reading for us all. Can I call Alexander Burnett first? I think that might help inform our consideration of a committee of what might be useful to do next.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you again to the committee for allowing me to speak today. I won't go over all the detail that has been given in the papers, but there are two main areas which I think justify keeping the petition alive and looking at the issue further. The first is Dr Cruikshank, in the summary in paragraph 23, is about the medical side, where clinicians frequently report a limited understanding. There's clearly a lot more questions to be asked around the medical side of Lyme disease and the diagnosis. I think we've probably all become probably more knowledgeable over the last 9 months over testing and various other aspects of this virus and recognition of these issues. And the second part is around the raising of public awareness, I think in paragraph 27 of the summary papers. And again, I think it's been raised previously, a lot of the MSPs on the committee, several representing rural areas like myself. I would just ask you, visit all parts of your constituencies and regions your own experiences of what adverts or warnings you've seen around Lyme disease. My own experience is it is non-existent, and questions to ministers would appear to confirm that there is little public awareness campaign going on. So those two main issues, the medical side and the public awareness side, raised by Dr. Cruikshank and Professor Lambert, I think justify further the committee continuing to look at the petition. There are a couple of recommendations for the committee is invited to consider. There's also one from the petitioners, which I would probably ask the committee to look at first, and that is to invite Professor Lambert and Dr. Cruikshank to give evidence and maybe formulate some questions, some further questions, which they could then write to the Minister for Public Health and the CMO to ask them to respond to questions from them and other evidence that's been submitted today. I think in time it would be proper for the Minister and the CMO to come and give evidence, but at this stage, and with other priorities around the COVID vaccine, I would think that a fair process would be to allow some more questions to be formulated and for the Minister and CMO to reply by writing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful. I think the issue that the committee will constantly struggle with throughout this period, and it's not about the significance of individual petitions, it's simply we're coming up against dissolution of Parliament, and there are then processes which happen in terms of what ones can be taken forward and which ones will basically not be able to do any more work with. So what I think we're going to be focusing on is how productive we can be in the time we have left round. I think what we all acknowledge, actually, a series of very important petitions, but this one I think we have all found and recognised as being important. I think I said this at the last session, but I was in the Crieff area, must have been just post-lockdown, and walking in various places there, and what struck me was the signs that I did see about Lyme disease looked as if they'd been here forever, and we're not exactly in a prominent place, not where somebody would maybe even pay any attention to them unless they were looking for them. And I think that's a big issue for me around public awareness, and I think that is something that we can usefully pursue. But I'm going to call committee members. First of all, Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I welcome Alexander Burnett's statement just now, and it's very helpful because it concurs obviously very strongly with a lot that's been said in the works we've had back from Professor Lambert and also Dr. Cruikshank. I agree absolutely. I think there is a very there's a lack of understanding with the GPs, also with people presenting with the problem. And secondly is I think the public awareness, and I too, Convener, agree, I'm actually staggered how little there is of awareness in the rural areas of Lyme disease being made, the public being made aware now that people have a right to roam and things like that. So we need to make sure that's addressed. I think we certainly must keep this petition open, and I would certainly seek to invite the Minister of Public Health and Wellbeing and Sport and the Chief Medical Officer to give evidence at a future meeting, and also for us to write to the Minister of Public Health, Wellbeing and Sport and the CMO to respond to the evidence given in the statements by Dr. Cruikshank and Professor Lambert, for which I thank them for. But it's very clear this is by no means a done deal. We need to look further into this, and we need to also engage with the landowners and people who manage land as well, and obviously farmers in this. But I think at the moment that's the next stage we should do, and I thank Mr. Burnett for his input as well this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. My colleague, I think we should invite the Minister for Public Health and Wellbeing and the Chief Medical Officer to give evidence to the committee. I think it's really important that we try and tackle this issue, especially around public awareness and medical profession. As anybody who's got dogs will know, there's a huge increase in the ticks this year. You couldn't take them out without taking them off. So it's something that's really, really important for anybody who uses outdoor spaces. And that we as a government are trying to promote everybody to get out and become active and become fit. So it's something that awareness should be raised. So I'm quite happy to ask the Minister to come before us to give evidence and the Chief Medical Officer. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I mean, we agree with David, the influx of ticks on dogs particularly, and that of course applies to the city, because knowledge in the city is not that as great as maybe in the countryside. But so there we need, and I'm always worried, whatever we decide is decided, how to keep these issues going on a continuous basis. It's easy just to make a noise in one point at one point in time, but to keep it going over many years is always difficult. So I would like to hear from the Minister exactly how that can be achieved. Therefore, sitting the government down in front of us to really pin down the issues, I think is absolutely important. Thank you.
Thank you. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener, and also thanks to Alexander for coming in. That's really useful. I think this is yet another petition where we get the evidence to say, well, there are good things happening, but then we look at Dr. Cruikshank and Professor Lambert's evidence, and it's pretty devastating, actually. GPs with limited experience are not confident in diagnosing. And, you know, the line where Professor Lambert admits that there have been many misdiagnoses in Scotland, which could have been avoided with more education. I mean, these are people's lives. I know a couple of people with Lyme disease, and it's really, really debilitating. And also the reluctance to develop experience due to the climate of controversy and litigation was actually quite worrying as well. I would certainly like to get the Minister and the Chief Medical Officer in. I absolutely agree with that course of action. And I do agree that, you know, although we are in a public health emergency with COVID, there are other things that continue, you know, as well. Life goes on. And this is not going to go away. And I really do think that the amount of evidence that we've had that says that there's just, you know, more that can be done, I think we need a face-to-face session. So I would agree with that course of action. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that people make a compelling argument for having a session with folk in front of us. I think we have to be alive to the fact there's going to be a limited number of occasions when we can do this in the next period, but this is one where it feels as if we've got lots of information, and just having them in the room and pursuing the questions feels to me to be useful. I do take Tom Mason's point that this is not just an issue for people in rural areas, but it's people who are travelling into rural areas and travelling into the countryside. One might argue that with COVID, where people have been travelling, they've been more likely to be travelling locally rather than abroad, and therefore basic education is probably something that would be very useful. I think but before we conclude, can I call Alexander Burnett back in?
Thank you very much, Convener, and I'm sure, given what I believe you're about to agree on, I think the petitioners and myself are very happy that you're continuing to keep this petition alive and involve the Minister and the CMO. I think that the extent of the disease and the fact that yourself are seeing awareness signs, others on other MSPs with their experience of ticks on dogs, and also knowing others with knowing people who have Lyme disease, just show the extent of this and how the MSPs understand how it does affect so many parts of our lives. Just as a final point, could I ask, and not for you to explain today, because I know your agenda is very full, but you mentioned the dissolution, and I can maybe just foresee the next issue that petitioners might be getting in touch with us as to what happens to their petitions when Parliament dissolves, and what happens to the petition, and what happens to the evidence and progress made to date on petitions. And I'm sure you probably want to explain that to all petitioners who might be worried coming up to the dissolution what's going to happen. But I know you have a full agenda today, so it might be something you take up or you write to petitioners.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we are agreeing the public session has been described. The balancing act for the Public Petitions Committee all the time is between dealing with the petitions in front of us and ensuring that we're not denying other petitioners the opportunity to access the system. So in the normal way of things, if a petition was closed, you can bring it back in a year's time if it's in the same subject. If a petition is closed and then the Parliament is dissolved, then petitioners can bring a petition back right away. I think the technical position is that we can carry over some petitions, but of course we want to make sure that the new Parliament is creating its own agenda around petitions, so we want to make sure we will be making a decision in our legacy paper which ones we'll be able to continue. But I think that what I would underline to petitioners, where the petition is closed, there is a further opportunity in the new Parliament to bring this back, and the wisdom, knowledge, information that's already sitting in the system around these issues continues to be there and can inform the thinking of whoever happens to be the petitions committee at that time. So it's not while the individual details about petitions will not be in the public domain, still the actual information is there in order to inform any thinking. I hope that's helpful, and we are agreeing, as is indicated, let's see if we can have a public session of the committee as described before Parliament. I'm going to thank Alexander Burnett for his attendance and for helping informing our consideration of the petition. If we can move on to the next continued petition on our agenda today, which is petition 1777, to introduce British Sign Language into the Curriculum for Excellence, lodged by Scott Macmillan. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to introduce the British Sign Language into the Curriculum for Excellence. This petition was last considered in October 2020. Since that meeting, we have received submissions from the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills and the petitioner. In his submission, the Deputy First Minister explains that it is for schools and local authorities to determine which languages are offered to pupils under the 1+2 approach, depending on the local circumstances and the needs of their learners and communities. The Scottish Government is unable to intervene and set requirements about the choices that schools make, and it therefore cannot require schools and local authorities to require BSL to be taught as a first language, L2, rather than a second language, L3. The Deputy First Minister also highlights the increase in the number of local authorities reporting that they delivered BSL in 2019. The petitioner accepts that the Scottish Government cannot intervene on what schools and local authorities decide to teach in schools. However, he states that more support is required to allow schools and local authorities to teach BSL should they wish to. I found this a very interesting petition, and I do feel rather that the Scottish Government is pushing back rather than thinking about what perhaps enabler role it might have in encouraging use of BSL. There is in the papers, for example, some comment about the fact, well, you couldn't do it in secondary school because there isn't a qualification. Well, why are we not asking the SQE to develop a qualification if that's the case? I felt there were barriers there that were not really barriers at all. In terms of raising awareness, I do think that the petition has effectively done that, but I think there is a question about how much further we can take it at this point. It may be that in future there would be a petition that would be asking about how do you get to the point where this language is treated sufficiently seriously that in fact there was a qualification for it, rather than that being used as an explanation of why we can't support it now. So one feeling is that we need to close the petition at this point, but I have no doubt whatsoever that there are opportunities for this question of BSL and its significance in terms of language and being able to communicate and so on, when that will be reflected on more seriously. But I'll call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to thank the petitioner, Scott Macmillan, for bringing the petition forward. It highlights, shall we say, the need for different languages to be taught, and BSL is one which is used by a wide section of our community. The Deputy First Minister's answer was very detailed in the submission, and I think that because British Sign Language is currently being taught as part of the Curriculum for Excellence, and that the Scottish Government is unable to intervene with the decisions with local authority, it's up to schools and local authority what languages they teach. I think under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders that we need to close the petition. But like you, I think, why isn't there a qualification for BSL? I think we've got to ask that question. And the petitioner, if he's not happy, I think should bring a petition back in the new Parliament. And just specifically on that question to see if he can actually get a qualification in it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. I'm in a bit of a dilemma here. There are issues which need to be expanded and continued, but I'm not quite sure that our position is such that we can make anything necessary happen. I mean, I'm drawn to the fact that, you know, giving a bursary for learning coming for STEM subjects, why that can't be extended for BSL, and getting more knowledge and use of the language as a general activity, I think is very useful. But whether we can do that in the petition, I think closing is really the only solution at this stage, so the petition to come back in very specific area as to what can be improved. One of the problems I find with quite a lot of petitions, they're too broad brushed, and therefore we can't make much progress. And I think if we close this at this stage and encourage the petition to come back with very much clear specifics as to what can be achieved, then I think we could then achieve something. Thank you.
Thank you. I take your point, but I think really what has happened here, in my view, is that the petition has been asking for specific action, and coming out of that, the explanation of the barriers would actually then allow the petition to become more focused. So the very fact the petition has existed has allowed us to get to that next stage, which I think is useful. But I'll call Gail Ross.
That's absolutely spot on. I agree. I think that the Petitions Committee have probably taken this one as far as we can, but there's absolutely nothing stopping the petitioner coming back now and asking the SQA to consult on introducing a new qualification. I know that it says that it's dependent on number of learners, number of teachers and the demand. Well, that can be looked into. So it's a really, really interesting petition. And again, thank you to the petitioner. But I do think that we have to close this, but certainly it's opened up an avenue for them to come back with a more specific ask.
Okay, thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I fully endorse what my colleagues have all said. Again, what you said, Convener, in relation to the qualification with SQA, and I think at this stage we should close the petition under Rule 15.7, standing orders. But as I say, and I would agree with future action by the petitioner to come back with a specific on this qualification, bearing in mind research done into uptake and teachers available, etc., in our schools. So I would recommend that approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are agreed then. We're recognising that the petition has illuminated a lot of important issues, and the response from the government actually also affords an opportunity for a way forward for the petition. But I think the broader question for me here is, if this language is important for people to communicate, then we should be ensuring that people are able to communicate in a language that's really important to them. And of course, there's a broader question about our ability in order for us to be able to be given the skills in order to communicate with people. And there's a whole range of issues, I think, that come out of that. But I think we have at least progressed an understanding of this question, and I think we are agreeing to close the petition as indicated, but in the new Parliament it may be the petitioner would choose to take a petition back in that regard, but certainly would afford opportunities to pursue further, I think, the important aims of the petition itself. But if we can agree to close the petition and thank the petitioner very much for taking the time to engage with us, I think we have found that very useful indeed. If we can now move on to the next continued petition on our agenda today, which is petition 1780, consultation on the closure of large shops on New Year's Day, by Stuart Forrest on behalf of USDO. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to launch a consultation on implementing legislation already in place to ban large shops from opening on New Year's Day. The petition was last considered in October 2020. Since then, the committee has received submissions from the Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, the Scottish Retail Consortium, Scottish Trade Unions Congress and the petitioner. In his submission, the Minister explains that this is not the time to run a consultation, given the significant challenges faced by the retail sector in relation to the coronavirus pandemic and the ongoing uncertainty regarding Brexit trade negotiations. The Minister states, however, that he will be, quote, seeking further views and opinions from unions and retailers and will advise the committee of my findings in due course. While the petitioner does not believe the current coronavirus measures should be a factor, as the first possible date that ban could be brought into force is on New Year's Day 2022, it does welcome the submission from the Minister, as it believes that it endorses the action called for in the petition. I know that my colleague Neil Bibby, MSB, has been exploring this question. He indeed raised it with the First Minister. My feeling is that things have changed completely from when this petition was first lodged. The legislation has been sitting on the shelf since, goodness, 2006, and I was actually in the Parliament when we discussed it at that time. And the argument Christmas was agreed and that we would consult on the new year. My own view is that these are such particular and different times, and I'm aware that the presiding officer has said if a regulation was laid, while it would be very unusual, it could be considered. I do think it's within the capacity of the Parliament to look at possibility of large shops not being open this new year. And the reason I think that's important is while we hear a lot about frontline workers in health and social care, and we salute them, I think there are also the people who are keeping our streets clean. There are the posties, and in particular, I would argue, shop workers who have been absolutely in the front line of dealing with this. And I think it would be good if we could see whether it was possible for that decision to be made ahead of this new year. It's not really in the role, it's not the remit of the Public Petitions Committee to do this, I accept that. But I would like to be able to afford the opportunity of the Parliament doing this. I don't accept the Minister's argument that this is not the time. We're putting through huge amounts of very significant legislation and regulation very quickly. And in fact, we would be able to give the Minister information to give us an indication of what that consultation might be. The Scottish Retail Consortium have said they don't support it. Trade unions have said they have. My sense is the public would support it as well. A consultation could be done extremely quickly. It's not necessary. There's nothing that outlines, as far as I know in the legislation, how long the consultation would take. And given how fleet of foot we've proven ourselves to be during the coronavirus, I'm sure we could well the means for that. So my view in this is that I think the petition is important. I think we can accelerate the process. I think it would recognise the very particular circumstances that we're in. What I would want the committee to do would be to write to the Scottish Government and to the presiding officer to say we believe the Parliament should have the opportunity, should be afforded the opportunity to make a decision in this. And while it's for the committee to decide whether they agree with that or not, I certainly think that we should be recognising some of the very important issues that are behind this. I'll call Tom Mason.
We'll do something very quickly. I would go along with that. I mean, we seem to do an awful lot of other things very quickly, although it doesn't leave us too much time. But I think if it can be done, I'll go along with that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. Gail Ross.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I'm a little bit kind of unsighted about how this legislation sits and what would be needed in order for us to do it this year. Well, it's not this year; it would be next year because it's New Year's Day. But and it's just in a couple of weeks, and I wonder. I know what you're saying about putting through other pieces of legislation at really, really short notice. And, we have done that. But I think the short notice has been, with consultation and other bits and pieces that we've had to do. I think that, I'm really wary about doing something that has such a big impact, certainly economically and, you know, in regards to family life, which is what we've heard about, you know, from both sides of the argument in such a short time without proper consultation. I would certainly be a little bit nervous about doing that. But like I say, I'm not fully sighted on how the whole parliamentary process in terms of that would work. I don't think that we should be closing it, certainly, but I would want to write back to the minister and just push a little bit more in the consultation, get a timescale, get an agreement that they're going to start at a certain point, and absolutely know that we have all the ducks in a row for doing it in 2022. I just think that time is against us now, given everything else that we're going to have to cram in before next week.
Okay, thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, convener. I fully understand the situation. I'm happy to support, along with Tom Mason, your comments on this. I think, as I say, and recognise the fantastic work our retail staff have done in shops over this current pandemic, and we're very appreciative of it because they've been under enormous pressure. But I think, yes, we just need to make sure we get this right, and if the programme of Parliament can allow, then I certainly think we should push ahead on that to get this in place as soon as possible. But certainly I would, as I agree with Gail Ross, is we do need to make sure we have our facts right in relation to making sure that whatever's brought forward is absolutely bang right and is implementable and practical. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, convener. I fully support the petition because I think our large retail units have eroded away at traditions which have been part of Scotland, Hogmanay, and forcing the workers into work. And I think our workers have been great through COVID-19, but also in the run-up to Christmas is the most hectic time for them, and they deserve the time off to be with their family. But I do not know if it is time to put legislation through to allow for New Year's Day off just now. So I'm quite happy to try and see if it is possible, but I would like to, like Gail, I would like to see a timescale for the retail strategy. So this is definitely in place for next year. I'd like to hear from the government for that. Thank you, convener.
Okay, I mean, I think my understanding is there is no obligation for the consultation to be a long process. The Minister is saying, oh, well, it takes too long, but we can consult, we know what the trade unions think, we know what the Scottish Retail Consortium thinks, but obviously you can actually, the Minister can make contact with them in a heartbeat. And the other group of people we need to consult with would be local authorities. Well, you know, I'm sure a Minister has them on a database. It would take half an hour to contact them and to get a response back. I feel that it may be that it's impossible, but I think the Parliament should be allowed at least the opportunity to consider it. And if the presiding officer has said, while it might be tight, it is possible, there's nothing that's stopping it happening, except whether we can find the time to do it. And that then becomes a matter of choice by the Bureau about what they're going to do. So, I mean, I hear very much what Gail is saying. I would want to make sure that if it's not going to be done this year, that the process is now ongoing immediately for next year, but I would not want to rule out the possibility of it being done this year. And I'm accepting the limited role of the Public Petitions Committee in this, but it seems to me that what we could at least do is write to the Government Minister and say, here's the evidence we already have. There's no obligation on you to have a lengthy consultation. If this is not the right time to recognise the amount of pressure that retail workers are under precisely because of coronavirus, when is the right time? And I'm also conscious that, you know, a lot of these large businesses themselves have acknowledged that this has been a windfall time for them. They have stepped up to the mark. They have done well out of it, but people still remain in you know, relatively insecure work if they work in the retail sector and under a lot of pressure and no increase, right? So What I would hope we could agree that we want to keep the petition open because we believe that at the very minimum it should be something that should be happening next time, but that we would write the Scottish Government and the parliamentary authorities in the terms that I have said, that is it possible to have a process which fulfils the obligations of legislation to consult, but there is nothing that stops them doing it right now. And the worst that can happen is that they can come back and say no, but I would want to underline that I don't know, I'm interested in what petitions the rest of the committee thinking is. It did feel to me that it was precisely the opposite response that we might expect from the Minister, rather than a can do, how do we sort this? This is not the time, and I would repeat the point. I think that I feel if this is not the time, then when is the time? But I'll call Gail back in. Gail Ross, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, I was just nervous about timescale. I absolutely agree with the petition. As I said before, I don't see any need for shops to be open on New Year's Day. And, you know, there was stuff in the petition about, and it's the start of the January sales and stuff. There's no such thing anymore. The sales are starting before Christmas these days. And we are in, as it's been said thousands of times now already, unprecedented times. I would just be a bit kind of, again, reluctant to tie up ministers and officials' time with this when they're, you know, obviously run ragged trying to actually save people's jobs and save businesses and stuff due to the pandemic and Brexit. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with that either. So yeah, I mean, fully agree with exploring what can be done, absolutely. But I do think that we should push the Minister for a timescale and get that commitment so that we absolutely know where we're going with it. Absolutely.
Okay, I think that there's two stages to this. We can at least ask the question, how quickly can you do it? And it's not acceptable, in my view, it's insufficient to say now is not the time, given this is actually, I think, has an impetus precisely because of what retail workers are under, but that we would say that if this is impossible, then we would want a very early consultation for next year. But I would at least want to test with the government and the parliamentary authorities. I think all the parliamentary authorities give advice about regulation, but I think we are agreed that we write to the government minister and we recognise the urgency of this, but that underlining that there is also a necessity of this to be sorted as soon as possible. So if it can't be done for this new year, then we don't want the thing drifting into the sand for any longer, bearing in mind that this has been on the statute book since 2007. I see Maurice Corrie wants to come in.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, now I agree entirely with what you just said there about the time, and I do actually support what Gail Ross is saying about getting a commitment to timings and things like that. So I just want to re-emphasise that it's important that we see some movement on that. Thank you.
Okay then. In that case, we're agreeing to write to Scottish Government in terms that have been outlined. Two stages. Is there something to be done now? But what are the plans, if not, to be done as soon as possible thereafter? I wouldn't want a further Public Petitions Committee to be looking at this next new year and discovering that yet another year has passed without actually a consultation taking place. If we can move on then to the next continued petition on our agenda today, which is Petition 1791, Referendum Scotland Act 2020 by Mike Fenwick. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to recognise and respond to concerns that Section 39 of the Referendum Scotland Act 2020 establishes a legal challenge, namely that it breaches protections afforded by the Human Rights Act 1998. Submissions have been received from the Scottish Government and the petitioner. The Scottish Government submission advises Section 39 specifically relates to court proceedings which are about questioning the number of ballot papers counted or votes cast as certified by a counting officer or by the Chief Counting Officer. Section 39 does not cover court or other procedures relating to concerns relating to campaigning or any other issue. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. My own sense, I think, is we've come to a natural conclusion on this one, but I'll call Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I agree. We've had the response back to say that The 8-week limit only applies to the number of ballot papers counted or votes cast. So the point that the petitioner has brought up is completely unaffected by the 8-week limit. So hopefully that's answered the question. So just to thank them for bringing it forward and to close under Standing Order 15.7. Thanks.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree fully with my colleague Ross on that, and I would move to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of the Standing Orders accordingly.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with my colleagues, and I'm happy to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders.
Okay, thank you. Tom Mason.
Entirely, I agree with that. We've gone as far as we can go with this, and we close it down.
Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. I think that we are agreeing to close the petition. We think we've come to a conclusion. I would say that I think that we as a Petitions Committee did take this seriously and tested the argument that was being proposed by the petitioner, but we are agreeing to close the petition on the basis of the terms that have been put by my colleagues, and we'd want to thank the petitioner for their engagement with the Petitions Committee. The next continued petition on our agenda today is Petition 1792, Access to Scottish Piers and Harbours, lodged by Thomas Butler. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to ensure that local authorities and service providers give access for those with disabilities at public facilities such as piers and harbours. Responses have been received from the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Highland Council. Clerks have attempted to contact the petitioner to seek their views in response to these submissions, but nothing has been received to date. Highland Council has provided a full response regarding their legal obligations and the specific issue of Uig Port. EHRC has noted the Council and Scottish Government responses to the committee in this petition without comment. Also notes more generally that efforts by organisations and public bodies to fulfil their legal obligations to improve public transport for disabled people are inconsistent. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action, and I'll call Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, thank you for those. This one, I think it's run its course as far as the work that we as a committee can do, and I'm obviously disappointed that there's been no responses from petitioners, despite the contacts by our clerks in the Parliament. Obviously, I realise the delays, the massive delays of the new ferries, etc. But nevertheless, I move to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that it appears that Highland Council has followed all the due processes for the Uig Port development regarding access with those with disabilities, and will further consult on this issue, which is important when it is able to do so. So I move to close the petition.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I think with a very detailed response from Highland Council, I don't think there's anywhere else for this petition to go, and I'm quite happy to close it like my colleague under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders.
Thank you. Tom Mason.
Convener, we've had very detailed responses from various authorities, and the process is ongoing and consultation is taking place. So I think we've achieved as much as we can do at this stage. So we should close it down.
Thank you. Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I was heartened to see a response from Highland Council, and they do recognise that disabled access to small boats is an issue. So I think satisfied at the moment that they've decided that they're going to hold an additional consultation. I suppose it just depends what the outcome of that is, given that nobody really seems to want responsibility for any further additional modifications to the pier. I don't see that we can take it any further until we know what the outcome of that additional consultation is, and of course the petitioner can bring it back in the next session once that becomes clear. So I feel that we have no choice but to close it at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I've had a request from Rhoda Grant come in. Rhoda Grant.
So sorry, Convener, coming in so late after you've had your discussions. I mean, this is something I've been involved with for quite some time. And I've been repeatedly asking the council to do an equality impact assessment. And I know there's difficulties in doing this, but I don't believe it is impossible. And I think in this day and age, we should be looking to, especially new developments like this, making them accessible to disabled people, because this development's going to have to last, say, 50 years or so. Hence, I think the community, the feedback I've had from the community is they are very keen to have disabled access. And you'll be aware that Skye is a big tourist area, so to allow people access to the water, to sailing and boating, I think is really important. And given the level of investment that's going to be there, we all know what's happened with the ferries, the amount of money that has been lost, wasted in developing these new ferries. So it seems very strange with that backdrop that, you know, the money can't be made available to allow disabled people to get access to the water, given that this pier development is due again to the new ferries, because they would not be able to fit into the harbour as it is. So I know the committee are keen to close the petition, but I would just maybe ask them to go back and ask for an equalities impact assessment, because I think it's really important we do this and provide disabled access to water sports and sailing for people going forward from the lake.
Thank you, Rhoda. My own feeling on this was that if you're doing something new, I understand if it's old structures, old buildings, there's a limit to accessibility and there's a limit on the obligation. But I think the obligation needs to be very strong in anything new, and it can't be beyond the width of humanity to work out how to make, you know, when you see what people with disabilities can do in climbing mountains and all sorts of things, you think it structurally wouldn't be that difficult to find a way of making sure that people can access the water. But I think in terms of what the committee can do, it does feel to me that we've come to a natural conclusion. I think that's what members have been saying. But it may be that in closing the petition, we would both say to the petitioners that this may be something they wish to pursue further with their MSPs, whoever they may be in the new Parliament, but also that we could be writing to the council, as Rhoda suggests, and ask, you know, have you done an equality impact assessment? And if not, why not? And just underline why this matters. Because otherwise you get to the point where people say, oh, well, this is all too difficult, so we're not going to do this. And in fact, the legislation, the pressure is supposed to be in the opposite direction. So I wonder if that would be satisfactory to the committee, that we are agreeing to close the petition. I think we've come to a natural conclusion, but that we would be writing to Highlands Council just to highlight that in closing it, we do think that an equality impact assessment is essential, especially the point that Rhoda makes, that this is something that's a new development and we would want it to be seen to be getting used actively for a long time to come. So if that's agreed, unless somebody's, I think I see Maurice Corrie wanting to come in.
Yes, thank you, Convener. No, I just wanted to just add on that, yes, I agree with the points, and sympathetic, being a sailor and yachtsman in the west coast of Scotland, absolutely, about the access to the water. But I do think, I don't change my view about closing the petition, but I agree with you, Convener, about making the point to the Council about the points you've just made and keeping the thing, answering those questions that you put forward in accordance with what Rhoda Grant made. Thank you.
Yeah, and one caveat, I guess, is that of course we're not, as a public petition committee, able to engage directly with what is a local issue. But what we'd be asking Highland Council is, in developments like these, is it their policy, and if not, to have an equality impact assessment, and if not, why not? And how essential it would be for them, whatever they're doing, that they recognise that role. So I think we are agreeing to close the petition in those terms. We'd want to thank the petitioner very much for highlighting these issues to us, and to remind them there's an opportunity to return to the Public Petitions Committee with the election of the new Parliament. If we can move on now to the next continued petition for consideration, which is Petition 1804, Halt Highlands and Islands Airport Limited's Air Traffic Management Strategy by Alistair McKechnie, John Doyd and Peter Henderson on behalf of Benbecula Community Council. Petition calls for the Scottish Government to halt Highland and Islands Airport Limited's air traffic management strategy project, conduct an independent assessment of the decisions and decision-making process of the ATMS project. And can I welcome back Rhoda Grant and Liam MacArthur MSP for this petition. This petition was last considered in October 2020 when we took evidence from the petitioners. Since that meeting, we've received written submissions from the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, Cormac Aileen-Shear, Dundee City Council, HIE, HIAL, Wogan Orkney Islands Council, Prospect and Shetland Islands Council. Several written submissions from the petitioners who have provided follow-up information to the evidence session on 1st October and also responded to the submissions received. Submissions have also been received from a variety of organisations involved in the aviation industry. The committee has also received numerous submissions which have been submitted anonymously. Since our meeting papers were circulated, a further 2 anonymous submissions have been received which have been provided to the committee ahead of the meeting. We want the committee to obviously reflect on this. My first reflection is there's been a huge response. My second comment is that I feel very strongly we need to be keeping good quality jobs in remote communities. Otherwise, how do these communities be sustained? We see young people, so I would declare an interest as someone with family on the islands, but it's not always economically sensible to do something which involves greater centralisation. And I think that's maybe what we're wrestling with today. I'm going to call Liam MacArthur, and then I'll call Rhoda, and then we'll have a discussion with committee members on how we take this forward. And I'll call Liam MacArthur first.
Thanks very much, Convener. Can I very much associate myself with the comments that you've made? This is an issue I've been engaged with for a couple of years now, since the proposals first emerged. And I think I would echo your sentiments about the importance of jobs, skilled jobs, well-paid jobs in our island communities. But from my discussions with some of those who undertake these roles, certainly in Orkney, while that is obviously a consideration for them, I think if they felt that the proposals being taken forward were right in terms of the delivery of lifeline air services to Orkney and the other parts of the Highlands and Islands, it would be difficult for them to stand in the way of them. I think their fundamental concerns are around the deliverability of the proposals that HIAL have put forward, and the sense in taking forward a centralisation programme on that basis. So I think it's perhaps a small but an important distinction in terms of the argument that they're making. Now, nobody, I think, disputes the need for modernisation. I think in terms of having the controlled airspace we need across the Highlands and Islands, a modernisation of the facilities that are there is certainly necessary. Some would argue long overdue. It's the model that HIAL are proposing to take forward, that centralisation model based out of a remote tower in Inverness. And I think I've heard various colleagues throughout this morning referring to the issues that have arisen in relation to the building of 2 ferries at Ferguson and the ballooning of costs that we've seen there, to the point where they're at the moment I think over twice the budgeted amount. And I think there are uncomfortable echoes with that, with what we're seeing in relation to this programme. And I think getting some kind of auditing handle on those costs in early course is going to be absolutely essential, not just for the islands communities that I and Gail and Rhoda represent, but actually for the taxpayer as well, who I think would find it unforgivable, given what we've seen recently in relation to Ferguson's, if that wasn't informing the approach being taken in relation to this. I take one example, which is the requirement, as I understand it now, for primary radar at each of the airports, which will involve a cost that was never as far as I can tell, going to this project. The communications infrastructure needed to deliver this across the Highlands and Islands is going to be eye-watering. I think as Hyle's own consultants identify, this is the riskiest and the costliest of the options being considered. And I think what those costs are likely to be has never been satisfactorily nailed down. And it's predicated, or has been predicated, largely on what is seen as a recruitment challenge for Hyle. Now, I think that needs to be taken seriously, but if you actually look at the figures, where the recruitment challenge exists at the moment, it's principally in and around Inverness. When Hyle is engaged in trying to recruit, particularly from the local workforce, yes, they've had to provide training, but in a sense, they've got a fairly stable workforce. When they recruit sort of ready-made replacements from Sweden or Finland, wherever, not unreasonably, those people are looking to return to their homes in due course. But Hyle have never taken seriously since that need to recruit locally, where you've got more likelihood of retaining that workforce. And at the moment, the problems, as I say, within the network seem to be within Inverness, which is where Hyle now want to concentrate the remote towers. So again, that element of these proposals just does not stack up. And finally, very briefly, we were promised an islands impact assessment. Hyle have made clear that they're not intending to change anything that they're doing on the back of whatever emerges from that islands impact assessment, which I have to say seems to drive a coach and horses through the kind of central tenets of the Scottish Government's Islands Act. We were promised that impact assessment around the summer, not unreasonably with COVID. That proved impossible, but the Transport Secretary was still indicating that he expected to see it by the end of September. I'm now, on the basis of an email from Hyle's Chief Executive yesterday, I'm led to believe that the board has receipt of the assessment, but will not be considering it formally until its board meeting in February. So the public isn't going to see this until well into the new year, months after it was promised. So I think there are a whole litany of problems with these proposals, but I think the fundamental one, Convener, is this issue around costs and how, whatever position we take on this, the public can be reassured that Parliament has a good oversight, and government has a good oversight of those costs, because we're already seeing signs that they're starting to spiral out of control.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I just ask you one question? Maybe I should know this. Was there ever any consideration of centralising this process, not in Inverness, but in one of the islands? Liam MacArthur? I don't know if we've lost Liam. It may be somebody who wants to come back in, and I'll call in Rhoda Grant.
Just on your comment there about, was there ever any plan to centralise it anywhere? Not initially. When we were first told of those plans, they said it could be based anywhere. I said I would put money on it, that it would be in Inverness. They never took me up on that. And I think that is really what the issue is, where the recruitment problems happen are in Inverness, where they're going to move the whole thing and therefore get themselves further recruitment problems. So I agree with everything Liam said. I agree with what you yourself were saying, Convener, at the beginning, because Hyle's a government-owned company. It was set up to mitigate the disadvantage of remote, rural and island communities, and sadly that policy they're pursuing here lies in the very face of it. The islands impact assessment, which they are now has now come into force, will come into force, sorry, on the 23rd of December. They will do one, but my understanding is it's about mitigating the damage they have caused by this policy, rather than looking at this policy through the eyes of an impact assessment. The air traffic controllers are really concerned about this. They're obviously concerned about their own futures, but they're extremely concerned, because they're the experts in the field, about how this will work. Unions are balloting their members just now about industrial action because of the impact of that. The technology is used in Norway and Sweden, but it's untested in island communities. So what happens when the weather is poor in island communities? Ferries go off first, and then the flights tend to be a bit more resilient to weather in that they can find times to fly. Now, if there was a technical issue when the weather is bad, there is no way of getting technical expertise over to these islands, so they would be totally cut off, unlike Norway and Sweden, where they have good road transport links to where those are based. Norway and Sweden have also got really good hardwired broadband. I'm told they have triple redundant resilience, which means that they have fallback positions, several fallback positions. Well, even if R100 comes on and is a good system, there is no redundant capacity. If that goes down, any link to those airports have gone down. The other thing we need to bear in mind is, as part of this, and going, I suppose, somewhat under the radar, is that they're looking to downgrade Benbecula and Wick as well, so that regardless of the centralisation, there won't be air traffic control at both of those airports. Now, for Benbecula, we know that it's used, the area is used by the MOD and as a test range, and that seems to me crazy that you would have the same number of flights, for instance, that are going out of Stornoway, going out of Benbecula, plus all the different air activities that take place and not have air traffic control. Wick, as Gail will tell you, is subject to decommissioning at Dounreay, and we should be doing everything possible to make Caithness more attractive for inward investment and locating new industry. And by making it less safe, I think, is not the way forward. And I suppose talking about them is very current. We need to think about the pandemic. We have learnt from the pandemic that not putting lots of people into one place is not a good thing because of infection control. So if we were in a centralised system at the moment, there would be real issues about the resilience of all the Highlands and Islands airports. If everyone was together, I think it makes sense that people are separate and can work safely just because of what we've experienced through the pandemic. Liam talked about the public purse and the prices. This is hugely expensive, it's untested, and there are cheaper ways of making the difference. Everyone wants better safety, but nobody wants it at this cost. And the staff have put forward ideas which are being just ignored by the company, and I think they are the experts who would know. And I mean, I suppose one example of how this technology is untested is, imagine a camera, and because people will be working with cameras, so you only have the view that the camera provides. But imagine that camera and working in high winds when someone's looking at it in a screen at a distance. Just the movement of the camera itself would make that very difficult for an air traffic controller to be able to watch for any length of time and be able to make decisions based on that. So I think we could look at delivering an air traffic control system at a fraction of the price that was safe and would also not damage the island economies, because we're taking reasonably well paid compared to other island jobs out of islands. Not only are we taking the air traffic controllers, but we're taking their partners who are normally working, within, say, health, the teaching and the like, out of those economies as well, and their children. So it's not just the safety, it is a huge economic impact. So I'd ask the committee to take evidence from the councils involved. I think they've had written evidence, but I think it would be good to hear what the councils are saying because of their concerns. And Liam MacArthur kind of skirted around it, but he maybe didn't make the plea directly. Is this something that the Auditor General should now be looking at? We've seen the ferries fiasco, and this is again a vanity project in exactly the same way. And can we maybe get the Auditor General in and look at this very closely as well?
Thank you, Rhoda. I'm going to call Gail Ross now on the basis that she has a constituency interest, which I think would help shape her thinking, and then we'll go back round the committee to look at how we can take it forward. Gail Ross.
Thanks, convener. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've written audit in big letters over my notes as well, so I absolutely agree with Rhoda Grant on that one. A couple of things that have come up. I think that the issue that you asked about, was it always going to be in Inverness? And Rhoda was absolutely right. There was a consultation, and I think I use that in very loose terms because I think we were all pretty certain that it was going to go to Inverness, and so it was no surprise when it actually happened. I did put on a push for it to come to Wick, Islands, to see if it would make any difference. And I actually got a couple of angry emails from a couple of people that were based in Inverness saying, you know, why on earth would we want to come up and work in Caithness? So I found that a little bit ironic, given now that everybody's being asked to go to work in Inverness. I think that this is probably one of the most contentious situations or issues in the constituency at the moment, and it's really quite worrying that there is so much black and white. You know, you're either for or completely against it. And the stuff that we're getting in, I mean, I completely agree about the economy and losing people, not just from the islands, but from remote rural areas as well. I do think that you know, there's so many aspects, and Liam and Rhoda have covered them really, really well. There's also the further discussion about the safety aspect, and there are a couple of people locally that have brought that up in very strong terms, Far North Aviation amongst others. And I think that, you know, when you've got people like that speaking in such strong terms, it's really something that can't just be ignored or swept under the rug. So I think that we've certainly reached a position where there is now far too much opposition to not take this further. There's one correction that I want to make in our papers. The petitioners have said in one of their submissions that the PSO for Wick is not due to be in place until 2023. That's not correct. We are looking at the budget in January with a view for it to be in place next year. But, you know, timescales permitting, that hopefully will happen then. So I have several things that I would like to do. I think, as Liam and Rhoda said about the Auditor General, absolutely keeping track of where all this public money is going. I would like to write to the Civil Aviation Authority to ask about the safety issue, because most certainly they're not going to pass these proposals unless they are absolutely solid. So I would like to know what consultation has already taken place and what their views are, and when they're going to be reporting on it in an official capacity. I would like to get HIAL and Transport Scotland in for an evidence session. I think it's all very well getting written evidence in, but I would like to be questioning them now. I think there's enough evidence in front of us to be questioning them face to face. Transport Scotland, because they are obviously the bridge between HIAL and the Minister, and the Minister seems satisfied with the plan. So I'd like to know what it is that Transport Scotland have seen that, you know, they're satisfied as well. And then perhaps we can take that and write to the Minister after we've got all that information. But certainly we are so far down this road now that I think that, you know, there's going to be no choice but to have to push to revisit this whole thing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Gail. Just to highlight that the Public Audit Committee has written out asking for suggestions for their work programme. So maybe this might be a useful thing that we could, as a committee, flag up. There's actually something specifically that we could be asking them to look at, because there are concerns about the scale of costs and to the extent to which it's matching what has been described before. My own feeling is that we should write to Civil Aviation Authority, Cabinet Secretary, flagging up these issues. I would support certainly having a HIAL and Transport Scotland in. The separate issue that I would want just to flag up is that a way long time ago, and I actually thought it was really important, there was a dispersal programme for civil service jobs, and there was active work by government to disperse jobs out into remote and rural areas. That seems to have completely stopped. And I think if the default position in the Highlands and Islands is to centralise into Inverness, then there's a massive problem. I'm aware that there's a lot of decisions being made around health provision where that's happening, and my worry is there's now an institutional mindset that thinks Inverness is rural, and if you concentrate to there, then that doesn't really have an impact. I think we need much more active government work. The very fact that a project like this, if it were safe, why does it need to be in Inverness? The truth is, with modern technology, nothing needs to be in our big cities anymore. And I would like to see, this is one of my own bugbears, but I would like to see public policy reflecting that flexibility again. And I would hope that we could, that might be something that we could at least flag up with the Cabinet Secretary in our correspondence. I'm very attracted to the idea of the Auditor General, but that might be the way to get into that. I'm now going to call David Torrance and ask for his response, and I will allow Gail, Liam and Rhoda back in briefly before we come to conclusion. But if we call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. You can see by a huge number of responses to petition that this is a very passionate issue, not only for rural but island communities. And I'm happy to go with all the recommendations that Gail Ross has mentioned, because this is something that affects our area, and she is more in touch with it than me. So I'm happy to go with all the recommendations to the committee. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Tom Mason.
Yes, Convener. I mean, this is really does worry me greatly. We have a situation where major expenditure is being taken place in one area of Scotland, which, although it involves only the northern part of Scotland, it does have strategic implications for the whole of Scotland. And I'm a bit surprised that government is not more involved in the decision-making process here. And the fact that it looks as though it's going to go way over the estimated costs, without anybody really monitoring that, worries me also. And added to which, there is so much mistrust on all sides. And to put a project into place like this, where there is so much mistrust, I think is a great mistake. Because whatever happens, if the local community and other groups can't buy into it, it will not, even with the best technology, it will not work effectively. Because there is always human intervention which is required, and that needs to be factored in. So, I mean, I'd hate to say we shouldn't start from here, but we are where we are. But I mean, certainly lots more information on safety, lots more information on finance, and to establish clearly what the strategic element is. And there's also development beyond what is being proposed at the moment. I mean, this will be good for a few years. Where is it going to go in 15, 20, 25 years? It doesn't seem to be part of the proposal. Therefore, we need this information coming in. We need to pin people down as to what's going on. And in fact, someone must sit back and really sort out rationally the risk factors, the options, and the finance connected with each, so that some rational decisions will take place. Because we've no choice in Scotland getting these things wrong, and to the expense of millions of dollars, millions of pounds, and also to the disgruntlement of people, various groups in the community. So we need these people in place in front of us, and to get much more public explanation as to what is going on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Maurice Corey.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree entirely with what Tom Mason is saying, and also my colleagues, and particularly Gail Ross on that, who knows the area extremely well. I have nothing to add other than to say that again, I agree we should write to the Labour Authority, we should Cabinet Secretary of Transport, and also invite representatives of the Highlands and Islands to come and present to us as a committee. This is a big issue and is a major infrastructure issue. We don't want the sort of fiasco we had with the 2 ferries that we've had built with lots of money being wasted. So we want to get it right. And I agree entirely with what Tom Mason's saying, is that we need some rational review on this and discussion on it to make sure we get it right. Can I bring in 2 points here? One is I think we also need to engage Loganair. I was interested in their comments. And I think the actual operators should be asked as well, however we might bring them in. And I also think that it's very interesting that Rhoda Grant made was the comparison to Norway, Sweden, and the backup situations, because that clearly has not been addressed. And I like that idea. The other point, if I may bring in, wearing my Armed Forces hat, yes, Benbecula ranges will always be operating. You can't legislate when operations take place day or night. And there's one issue there in one of the submissions that refers to that and the safety of that. That needs to be looked at as well. So I think the whole thing needs to be checked over, obviously an audit done, and to make sure that they follow up the points that we have considered amongst us as a committee here this morning. But I think generally speaking is the dispersal programme, which you brought up, Convener, of jobs to rural areas and islands, absolutely a very good point indeed, and government should be following through on that. And apart from that, I commend the points that we've all made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps I should flag up for my friends in Inverness. I'm not arguing for what not to go to Inverness, but I think in terms of the whole Highlands and Islands community, we should we stop from the safe option being the Central Belt to the safe option being Inverness, and I think that's, there are communities who should be liberated by modern technology, and I don't think that's been harnessed sufficiently. But anyway, I'm going to call back in Liam, Rhoda, and then Gail, and I think we can come to a conclusion after that. I am mindful that we're creating a lot of work for the committee. The committee may want to think about what of this we can do now, or are we recognising this is one of those that has to be a legacy petition, but that's for another day to make final decisions around that. So I'll call Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Joanne. Just on that very point, could I thank the committee very much for the seriousness with which it's taken this petition. I've been trying for some time to stimulate a degree of wider interest in this, and I think that the scrutiny the Petitions Committee has brought to bear is absolutely welcome, and I think greatly appreciated by the communities I represent, and Rhoda and Gail likewise. I think the point you made about the job dispersal, John, is absolutely on the money. There was almost a kind of an assumption, and I think Gail alluded to it in her earlier comments, that if the jobs remain in Inverness and therefore in the Highlands and Islands, then that's all right. But frankly, if you want to live and work in the islands, you want to live and work in the islands. As soon as you then get back onto the Scottish mainland, does it matter a great deal which part of the Scottish mainland you're in? If you were to ask many of my constituents, no. And for those carrying out these roles, if they're being required to move to the Scottish mainland, their chances of actually securing higher paid employment for the roles they're performing, whether at Prestwick or Glasgow or Aberdeen or further south, are far greater than they would be in Inverness. So addressing the recruitment challenge that Hyle has won't be done through this meeting. In a sense, it may very well be that they lose much of that expertise to the organisation. And frankly, routing these jobs, these skilled and well-paid jobs in the islands and in these remote communities is absolutely essential. And it should be part of the ethos and the requirement that's placed upon both Scottish Government but also agencies of government, and I think Hyle falls into that category. So I think the points that you made in that regard are absolutely spot on. I think for Rhoda, if I skirted around the point about audit, I do apologise. I was seeking to nail it. I think the audit trail on this stuff is absolutely crucial, because we can make all the other arguments in terms of safety, in terms of job creation or job retention, economic impacts, the delivery of lifeline services. But frankly, I see the most worrying signs here being in relation to the audit. This is a project that's already showing signs of being way ahead of budget, and we're barely beyond the kind of first base on it. So I think if the committee, in the time it has available, can concentrate efforts on focus on that, that will be, I think, very worthwhile. In terms of the jobs implications, Logan Air, all the rest of it, absolutely ought to be asked to give evidence. But I think it's the local authorities, the local communities that will give you a better sense about the jobs implications for these communities. But thanks very much indeed, Convener. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. I appreciate getting called back. I think we need to be clear. I mean, we're against the centralisation of those jobs because I think that is unsafe. So it's not about pro or anti-Inverness. I'm very clear about that. I'm not suggesting the staff in Inverness should have to move any more than the staff in Wick, Stornoway, Orkney. You know, those staff want to live and work where they are. That's where their families are based. That's where their partners work. So it's really important that this is not one community against another. It's about the rights of everybody to remain living within their communities, and not just because we want them to live within their communities. I believe it is the safest way. Now, air traffic controllers, regardless of where they're based, so even if they were all in Inverness, each of those people would have to have training in each of the airports they serve. So most likely they would be trained in working within 2 airports, and that would create some resilience. Well, there's no reason why at the moment the air traffic controllers can't be trained to work within 2 different airports, so you could have that resilience. Liam talked about what HIAL had done, and actually HIAL are due a huge amount of credit about how they went about recruiting air traffic controllers in the past. They recruited young people within their communities, trained them up, and those people don't want to move. They want to live and work in their own community. So those on the island communities were much more likely to stay in those communities. And once you were on the mainland, as Liam says, you know, it's as easy for you to get, you know, from Inverness to, you know, how many other destinations. So if you're working in Inverness, HIAL don't pay well in this area compared to other airports. So therefore there is a work shortage and a huge market. So those people who can travel to do this work travel, and that is a big issue. So putting everybody in Inverness actually says to people, well, actually, if you can't live, you know, in Stornoway, well, you could actually be working in Dubai and being paid many times more than you're being paid where you are. So there was some talk about allowing the staff to work and commute, but that doesn't work within family life. And it was suggested to me that it would be HMRC would not tolerate that into the future. They would, as a stopgap, to allow people to move, but not into the future. So once you say to those people, you have to move, the chances are that they will move, but they'll move where there is a lot of money to be made, and they could commute from there as well. So I'm really pleased that the committee is taking it seriously. I think we need to make sure what we're doing is safe, and we also need to make sure that we protect remote and island communities. And I would ask that, I know the committee is taking a lot of evidence and speaking to a lot of people, but I think the councils are a good starting place about the economic impact. Now, it would be good maybe to get them to give oral evidence to the committee, because I think they could give them an awful lot more information about what's happening. And obviously within those communities, councils are also speaking to the staff on the ground and have a really good appreciation of what is at stake here. We really need to get HIAL to have a second thought about this and improve the infrastructure, yes, but this is just totally wrong-headed.
Okay, thank you very much, Rhoda. And finally, Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. So the way I see it, we've got 3 main issues. we've got the issue of public money, so we can write to the Public Audit Committee to see if they can put that on their work programme, as was suggested. We've got the safety aspect, so we can write to the Civil Aviation Authority to ask them where they are in their deliberations and when that's going to be published. And we've got the impact on the islands and remote rural communities in terms of the economy and making people move, which is, you know, a wider impact than just the air traffic controllers. It's their families as well. And you know, I understand what Rhoda and Liam are saying from an islands perspective. If you go onto the mainland, then you might as well work in Glasgow or Dubai or wherever you want to go. I can assure you that people in Caithness don't want to move to Inverness or to travel up and down to Inverness every day to go to a job either. So, you know, just to put that on the record, there are a lot of people here in the far north that are not happy with how that has been decided. I think that we, and convener, correct me if I'm wrong, we do have evidence in from affected local authorities. Again, I'm going to put the suggestion to get HIAL and Transport Scotland in, because I think I have too many questions now. I want to be able to ask them face to face and to hear what they have to say. And then I think, depending on what we get back from the CAA, what we get from oral evidence from HIAL and Transport Scotland, then we'll form the basis of what a letter to write to the Minister with some other recommendations. And I mean, I must say, at this moment in time, probably along with Liam and Rhoda, my recommendation would to be scrap the whole thing and start again. So we'll see where we go and what other members think, but certainly that would be my three suggestions for action at the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think that really summarises very effectively where people want to go on this. We want to look at audit, we want to look at safety, we want to look at economic impact. I will continue to bang on about dispersal of public jobs, because in truth in the past, and I think instinctively still, there were people who would happily have everything in Edinburgh. Any top quality, good quality jobs would stay in Edinburgh. It requires real political will not to do the easy thing. And you know, Inverness has benefited from that, and that has been wonderful. But I think we would hope that we could see that creative approach going further. I personally think we're going back the way, but I think that as Gail has highlighted, we can discuss with the clerks how best that then looks in terms of a panel, how realistic that can be before the end of the parliamentary year. But even if it were something that was continuing into the new session, I think we would be highlighting, underlining, emphasising, stressing that we regard this as an important issue. And there is a degree of urgency about it, because if there's an audit question, then that needs to be dealt with very quickly, because then there comes a point, otherwise, well, having gone this far and having spent this much, can we really go back? So I think that is something we would hope that could be addressed speedily. But I think we've come to a reasonable conclusion on that, and I have no doubt whatsoever that our colleagues who have visited us today will continue to work with the Public Petitions Committee, making sure that we have an effective scrutiny of these proposals in all of the issues that have been highlighted. So with that, can I thank Rhoda Grant for attending for this one? I think she may be attending for another one, and Lee MacArthur on this particular issue and helping us shape our thinking. And if we can now move on to the next continued petitioner agenda, which is Petition 1818, to introduce regulations on residential use of trampolines, lodged by Stacey Clark. Petition calls on the Scottish Government to implement regulations on the ownership and use of residential trampolines. Since the committee's last consideration, submissions have been received from the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, Scottish Gymnastics, 2 from the petitioner and 1 from Eddie MacDonald. These are summarised in the clerk's note. The Minister's submission advises that temporary or movable structures such as trampolines do not generally require planning permission, and has no plans to extend the requirement for planning permission or to introduce a system of licensing for them. I will come round the committee on this, but can I just say there's been a bit of commentary and reaction, I think, from the petitioners about, I think it was a comment I made about trampolines and whether regulation was the most important thing. I have had experience of people coming to see me to complain about the misuse of trampolines. That is almost willfully using trampoline late at night, using it with adults, and really a form of antisocial behaviour. So it's not to dismiss what people's experience is at all, because people who are antisocial in behaviour can be remarkably creative in how they do that. I think the tension here for me is that for a lot of families, young people, trampoline is actually a very important thing for them in terms of family activity, exercise, and perhaps even more so in the pandemic. But I think the question is how, for me, I still think that we have not heard an argument for saying that you would need planning permission or you would need regulation. But you do need active engagement in the local community with people who are making other people's lives a misery. And if they're making lives a misery because of trampolines, then there are authorities there who should be able to respond to that and take that seriously. That has been the bugbear of dealing with antisocial behaviour all of my political life, which is that the system doesn't necessarily recognise the ways in which people's lives can be made difficult. But I'll be interested in what other committee members think about this, but I'm not sure really if the solution offered in the petition is one that actually addresses the underlying general problem. We can make no comment on people's individual experience of this. You know, again, it may be, I've had this experience that a family is using a trampoline as a family would, but for somebody else, they just the noise at all bothers them. It's that balance in our communities between young people out playing football and people are having to listen to them out playing football. So it's not always an easy or a direct issue. Anyway, I'll call Tom Mason.
Social behaviour with neighbours is always a difficult issue, and each problem takes on its own characteristics, and it never improves as time goes on, because they don't. Unfortunately, neighbours don't talk to each other. I think the only thing we can offer, in my mind, in addition to what information we've got, is that it may be that those purchasing trampolines and things don't realise that the disturbance they might be making to their neighbours, and maybe the sports council, whatever, can issue or arrange for a code of conduct for use of trampolines might be useful. I mean, that happens, and this code is included with the manual instructions when they purchase the trampoline. I mean, that is done in a number of places where I think use of model aircraft and this sort of thing have a code of contact, and drones as well have a certain arrangements for use and care of things and the effect on neighbours. So I think that could be somehow encouraged in this, but as a committee, I don't think we can do too much at the moment. So in my mind, we need to close this, but maybe with the recommendation of some code being brought into existence, so that people do understand what disturbance they could be causing to neighbours. But otherwise, the arrangement for noisy neighbours in all sorts needs to be generally improved, but that's a whole different issue.
Yeah, okay, I think that's right. I think it's an issue about how antisocial behaviour is expressed rather than whether it's the specific area. Gail Ross?
Thanks, convener. Yeah, I mean, as was said before, it's a really difficult one. Neighbour disputes happen all the time, and they can get quite nasty. I think that, as a petitions committee, without getting too far into the who's right and who's wrong of this, the Scottish Government have said that they're not planning on introducing any kind of planning system for trampolines. They don't see it as a good use of public funds, and there are protections through various pieces of legislation at the moment for local authorities to investigate complaints that fall into these categories. I do also take on board the Scottish gymnastics evidence that says that if we went to a planning system, it probably put a lot of people off, and therefore, you know, we want as many young people to get the physical activity that comes with the fun of playing on a trampoline as much as we can. So, you know, whilst I have every sympathy for the individual issue, I don't think as a petitions committee we can take this any further. So to thank the petitioner, to suggest that it might be something that they continue to pursue with their local elected representatives, but to close under 15.7 of standing orders. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I concur with the points that have been made. And I think, and I take up on Tom Mason's problem, because I'm on my role in the cross-party group for safety and preventive access. We've got an issue over the code of conduct for users of beach toys, i.e. lilos and inflatable toys and dinosaurs and what have you, which sometimes get out in the middle of the Clyde with a young 2-year-old child on. And how do you actually enforce the legislation on that, which is nearly impossible. So you have to do it through a code of conduct and conditions of using it by manufacturers and the users. And I think the same applies here. It is a sensible, possibly introduction of a code of conduct by the manufacturers and the people who sell these apparatus to consumers. But I think my own experience as a counsellor, these are the things that are covered under antisocial behaviour and also noise and rowdiness issues that are normally held within between neighbours and what have you in various areas. So I would certainly suggest that I'm comfortable that the legislation is covered under that way. So I would therefore propose that we do close this petition under Rule 15.7 standing orders on the basis that we've discussed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I don't think the Petitions Committee could take this any further because the government's no plans for requirement for planning permission or introduce a licensing system. So I'm happy to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of standing orders.
Thank you very much. I think there's agreement that we'd want to close the petition, that the solution proposed is not one thing that addresses the problem, which is actually about how people misuse equipment rather than something that's inevitably caused by having the equipment. And we could remind, of course, the petitioners they may wish to return to the committee in the new Parliament with a petition that tries to address that question, but also to highlight that this is the kind of issue, if people are complaining about antisocial behaviour and the authorities at local level are not responding, then that's something directly the individual local MSPs would be able to take up. So we want to agree to close the petition, but to thank the petitioner very much for bringing this question before us, and we recognise that by its very nature antisocial behaviour uses opportunities afforded and it's expressed in very different ways, and it can be very difficult, but there's been suggestions about that might get taken forward, but we'd want to thank them for their engagement with us. The next continued petition is petition 1819, NHS bursary for Scottish paramedic students, lodged by Rachel Taylor. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to introduce a bursary for paramedic students across Scotland. In her submission, the Cabinet Secretary agrees that the issue of financial support for students undertaking a degree in paramedic science is worth further consideration, and reiterates that it will form part of the planned allied health professionals education review. The Cabinet Secretary also states that the Scottish Government is happy to engage with the petitioner and her fellow campaigners, highlighting that the Minister for Health, Sport and Wellbeing has recently accepted an invitation to meet with a campaign group. In her response, the petitioner acknowledges the review, but explains that it may take some time and student paramedics require financial support now. She believes that without increased support for student paramedics, the BSc Paramedic Science course will only be accessible to those who can support themselves. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. My own feeling is that I think at one point in their evidence, the Cabinet Secretary says, well, competition for places is very high, but that does mean that if people are financially have problems, they're not even be able to be part of that, and they're not getting the chance to compete. So they're being excluded from the competition because of their financial situation. And we do recall, I think, very effective evidence in the evidence taking session a couple of months ago. I am encouraged by the fact that the Cabinet Secretary's committed to engaging with the petitioner, and that there's work done around the Allied Health Professional Education Review. So for me, it may be one that we can think about closing on that basis, but I would be looking for reassurances that the Scottish Government actually does understand there's a big issue of access and justice and fairness about this. But I'll call Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. I would agree. I think that there's quite a lot of emphasis on the support that they already get in Scotland with the no tuition fees and the starting salary and things like that. But as the petitioner points out again, paramedics, why should they, or why are they treated differently than nurses and midwives who have to do the same training and have to do the on-the-job stuff, which prevents them really from getting an additional job? So therefore, it's only people that can really afford it that can go forward, and that's not equity. And they're absolutely right. I do agree that it's good to see that there's going to be engagement with the petitioner, and that the issue is being actively considered. Again, as a petitions committee, I think that we've done quite a lot of work on this. I think that, due to the petitioner's tenacity, this is now being looked at, and they should be congratulated on that. I don't know if there's much more that we can do at the moment until we see where this is going. So I would agree that I don't think we have any choice but to close it, but again, to reiterate to the petitioner that if they're not happy with the direction of travel, they don't have to wait a year. They can bring this back in the new term of the Parliament. And I think that that's something that they might want to possibly do. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I concur exactly what Gail Ross has said in her comments, and basically I would move to close the petition under Rule 15.7 on that basis. Although I think it's encouraging to see the Cabinet Secretary of Health and Sports reply and response on the 28th of October to be quite reasonably supportive of it, and also engaging to look at it further. So I'm encouraged by that, and therefore I have confidence in proposing the closure. And I think maybe if whilst we're closing it, the question is about the allied health professionals, and Convener, you alluded to that earlier on. Maybe we can make some sort of correspondence to the Scottish Government in the process of closing it on that particular point that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I don't think the Petitions Committee could take this any further. The key for me is that the Scottish Government is engaging directly with the petitioner, which I think is really good, and that they've considered the issue of financial support for paramedic students. So I'm quite happy to close it under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders.
Thank you. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with my colleagues. I think we need to close this because we've gone as far as we can go. But I think if we can get some assurance as to the timescale of the review, might be useful, just to prod the process along a bit. But otherwise, we've gone as far as we can go.
Thank you very much. I think we are agreeing to close the petition then under Rule 15.7. We are reassured that the Scottish Government is engaging with the petitioners. If that proves unsatisfactory, the petitioners clearly have the opportunity to return. But I would want to be writing to them to highlight this issue of equity, that because you're financially in a position that you can't take on this opportunity, even if there are lots of people, you've been excluded from that competition. And the point that Gail Ross makes, that other allied professionals are getting bursaries. And there's that question that to me has never really been answered. And it wouldn't be sufficient to say, well, it's because it's popular, given that then excludes people who are not in that position. And, it does rather beg the question about why they've moved in this direction when people were able to work and learn on the job, which maybe is a whole broader question. But we are agreeing to close the petition We recognise how far the petitioner and her fellow campaigners have taken this. We would hope that they'll keep it under review. I'm sure they will, and that there'd be an opportunity to come back if they felt that would be useful. But we will write to Scottish Government specifically asking and highlighting this question of equity. If we can now move on to the final continued petition on our agenda today, which is petition 1825, dedicated facilities for women with unexpected pregnancy complications, lodged by Louise Caldwell. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to ensure that maternity departments have dedicated facilities for women experiencing unexpected pregnancy complications. Since the petition was last considered in October 2020, we have received submissions from the Scottish Government, Miscarriage Association, Royal College of Midwives, Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists, SANS, Scottish Early Pregnancy Network and Tommy's. These submissions explain that the National Bereavement Care Pathway for Pregnancy and Baby Loss has been developed in Scotland and was launched in 5 early adopter sites earlier this year. The Scottish Government-sponsored project has developed pathways for 5 types of loss, including miscarriage, ectopic and molar pregnancy, in consultation with over 45 healthcare experts and 25 parent advisors. The aim of the project is, quote, to ensure that the woman is cared for in an appropriate care environment by staff who are sensitive to her needs. Part of the pathway, NBCP bereavement care standards have been set, which NHS boards are expected to meet. One of these standards is that all units, whether in hospitals or smaller services, are expected to have access to a room where bereavement care can be provided in a suitable and sensitive environment. Now, wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. I think, again, this is a very sensitive issue, and I think that there's some reassurance in the responses that we have received, and it may be that this is as far as we can take this. I think it's been given, we provide an opportunity to highlight something that can be exceptionally difficult for mums and for families. But I'll call Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, this is an extremely sensitive petition, and I think we're all hopefully understand, and we thank the petitioner for raising this very important issue and also the submissions that they have made. I think in relation to what has now moved forward since the petition was laid, I see a progress has been made with NHS hospitals and people understanding, and particularly through the National Bereavement Care Pathway for Pregnancy and Baby Loss, which has been launched, and the pathway sets the bereavement care standards for all NHS boards to meet. It's important those boards meet them. As I say, I think we've taken this petition as far as we can at this stage, but I would add one point, which is the psychological care is very important for the mother in this case, and particularly in the bereavement process. And I would just like to emphasise that if we can in this process, because I know how important that is. So I would propose that we close the petition under Rule 15.7 standing orders on the basis I've given that we have a pathway there for pregnancy and baby loss, and indeed there is a pathway which sets the bereavement care standards for all NHS boards to meet. But I would add on that I'd hope that would include psychological care as and when needed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with my colleague. Seen as a pathway has now been developed and the standards have been set for all NHS boards to meet. I'm quite happy to close a petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders, and the petitioner could always bring it back to Parliament if it feels that the standards have been met by any NHS boards, or if there are any problems in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree with my colleagues. We seem to have a standard now set, which hopefully all boards will aspire to. But I do take on Maurice Corrie's indication clearly that the physical part of this is important, but the personnel and training of personnel and attitude is all important as well. And sometimes that's in fact more important than the actual physical facilities that may be available. But I think we can't do much more at this stage, and the fact that it can be brought back later should petitioner require, I think, will be a comfort if things don't go quite right. Particularly, it might be the focus might be narrowed down to a particular board as this is put into implementation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gail Ross.
Thanks, convener. Yeah, another really sensitive one. I think that most of the organisations that we heard back from highlight the National Bereavement Care Pathway, and I think that they are all satisfied that the physical and the psychological needs of women and families in this instance is being noted and is up to the standard. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists also have their framework for maternity service standards. So I think it just remains for us to thank the petitioner wholeheartedly for bringing this, as you say, really important subject to the fore, and just making sure that we do have a national standard and approach, which I think has been proven that we do. And if any of the health boards or individual healthcare facilities fall below that standard, then I think that we would certainly want to hear about that. So, as Tom Mason said, encourage the petitioner, if this hasn't addressed her concerns, to bring it back as within their right. But I think that as a committee, we have taken this as far as we can, and I'm satisfied that the issues have been addressed. So I would close under 15.7 of standing orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail. I think we are all agreed that this is a sensitive petition and an important one. I think we note the interest in it and the seriousness with which people have responded to us. And I think we are encouraged that there is a pathway that recognises not just physical care but psychological care. So we would be agreeing to close the petition on that basis, and we would want to thank the petitioner very much for engaging, particularly in the circumstances in which that was done. So we'd be agreeing to close the petition on that basis and thank the petitioner. I'm now going to suspend. I'm proposing to suspend for 5 minutes. So we'll come back at 12:14. At 12:14. Thank you. Just suspend now. Can I call the meeting back to order, and we now deal with the third item on our agenda, which is the consideration of new petitions. The first new petition is petition 1837, provide clear direct investment for autism support, lodged by Stephen Layton. The petition is calling on the Scottish Government to clarify how autistic people who do not have a learning disability and/or mental disorder can access support and allocate investment for autism support teams in every local authority or health and social care partnership in Scotland. And can I welcome Alexander Burnett, MSP, for this petition. A submission has been received from the Scottish Government. The petitioner was invited to respond to this submission but has not done so to date. The Scottish Government highlights that support for autistic people is available from a wide range of sources, including health and social care partnerships, national organisations like Scottish Autism and the National Autistic Society for Scotland, and local organisations, including autistic-led organisations. The Scottish Government advises it is also working collaboratively with the national autism charities and autistic-led organisations to deliver a national autism post-diagnostic support service. I'm going to call Alexander Burnett first before we reflect on how we might take this petition forward. Alexander Burnett.
Thank you very much, Convener, for having me back for the second time this morning. And I'd just like to note my interest as a co-founder of a cross-party group on autism. I'm sure the other colleagues on the committee, as constituency or regional MSPs, will have a huge amount of casework related to autism, and the scale of the subject is really one that requires further consideration at a number of points. I've noted a lot of the submissions and the responses from the government, and I also see the recommendation that the petition could be closed for 3 reasons, and I'd just like to address very briefly those reasons. The first is that the Scottish Government is working collaboratively to deliver a national autism post-diagnostic support service. I think that fails to recognise that one of the largest problems facing people with autism is actually diagnosis, and the length of time to actually receive a diagnosis is shocking, and that's the main problem, is they don't get diagnosed in time, and subsequent services and support is therefore delayed. On the second point, the government has said that it's established a national autism implementation team to support health and social care partnerships. I would like to point out that the petitioner works in this sector, and it's his real lived experience of how this is not working is why he has brought this petition. And the third point is around the 1.2 million of funding the government said was spent supporting a national mapping exercise with each local authority. And I would just point out that this was back in 2011, this strategy, and I've read the comments this morning that back then said that there was a realisation that a concerted effort was needed to make sure that something was done. And I would just point out that we're nearly a decade on, and whilst much has changed in the landscape of organisation in local authorities, with integration authorities being created, it would be an extremely bold statement to say that the lives of autistic people have improved in that time. So I would really just be urging the committee to keep the petition alive, and to perhaps be able to give the petitioner an opportunity to respond, but perhaps to also invite 2 organisations mentioned throughout a lot of the evidence submitted, namely Scottish Autism and the National Autistic Society, to also respond and maybe clarify to the committee their views on some of the comments made by the government, because I think the feeling would be that there is plenty of talk about things being done, but our own experience on the ground for those dealing with autism cases and corresponding with our various local authorities is that there is very little evidence to show that this is actually materialised within local authorities or healthcare partnerships. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is an issue that we obviously did ask the petitioner to respond, and they haven't done so, and there may be very good reasons for that. I'm alive to the fact that this is the first opportunity to discuss this petition, and the pressure on the committee is simply to try and work out is there something we can do while we're only going to be operating till March. I personally think that what has just been said would reflect the fact that if we're closing this petition, it's because we're deciding we haven't got the time to do something really serious with it, because there's been suggestion that these reasons given by the Scottish Government need further interrogation. And when the Scottish Government does respond at first opportunity to a petition, the argument they make is convincing and compelling, then it's entirely reasonable to close it. But given that there has always been a suggestion that this needs to be tested a bit further, I wonder if there's something that we could do. Then we have to make a judgment on it. We don't want to misrepresent what we can do, but I wonder if it may be that we at least give the petitioner the opportunity to respond. But I would be very much guided by my colleagues and what they think on this. The big issues here will not go away, and it may be that again that this is something that can be that would be reintroduced in another session of Parliament. But I am aware that this is only our first look at it, and it might be that we want to use something further with it, recognising the seriousness of the issues that have been flagged up. But I'll call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Like you, I'm in a bit of a dilemma with this petition. Does the committee have time to do justice? But I'd like to keep the petition open, and the issues that Burnett's raised, I'd like to write to the Scottish Government to see if we can get some answers on them. And we could come back as a committee and decide then, once we get some answers back from the Scottish Government. But I'm open to any other suggestions from the committee members. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, David. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. We certainly should keep this open at this stage. We obviously, Alec Burnett has raised some queries to the statements the government has made, and I think we should certainly write to the government again to get them to address those issues as raised by Alec Burnett, and in order to open those issues up to get a balanced discussion. And hopefully the petitioner can make some statements as well. So we have till March to come. That's a few months yet, so there is time to get some written information in, and we make a decision at that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I mean that's strong evidence from Alexander Burnett on behalf of the petitioner. I would, I think we should keep it open. I would encourage the petitioner to get back in touch themselves. I think it would be interesting to hear the views of organisations that specifically deal with autism. So I guess National Autistic Society, Scottish Autism, to see what their views are. And I mean, I'm open to writing back to Scottish Government, to the Minister, to get their views on what's come up during this meeting as well. Convener, thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Convener, yes, I'm a member of the Mental Health Cross-Party Group and also the one on dyslexia, so close to my heart this subject, and I do welcome the strong points put over by Alexander Burnett this morning, and thank you for those, Alexander. This is one that I believe we should certainly keep open, and I certainly would encourage the petitioner to respond if they could, and I also would like to hear more from the appropriate organisations to deal with who deal with autism and that area, because I think it's a vitally important one, and it's those that go undiagnosed is really, really important that we get some handle on this, and the government through the medical world and support world gets some handle on it. But could I also suggest we might talk with or seek some evidence from the Children's Panel organisation in Scotland, because sometimes this people with autism can come across those panels from time to time. And I think it'd be very useful to have some practical input from them as well, just a sort of background to that, so we know the full extent of this.
Can I suggest that in the first step is to write to the organisations that support people with autism to get their sense of what, you know, if what Alexander Burnett has said is accurate in their experience, because what it seems to be to me is that the petitioner is somebody with autism but without learning disabilities, and he's finding himself going round and round a system that's not reflecting his particular needs. And there is also an issue about just the wide range. I mean, it is a spectrum, and therefore, by definition, the wide range of needs that are there, and perhaps that there are. I also find quite compelling this argument about the issues about diagnosis, because things follow from diagnosis, but if you don't have a diagnosis, that's problematic. Perhaps I could suggest to Maurice that the issue of the children's hearing system might be next stage, because that would be trying to understand. Because it may not be that that's the case, that young people with autism but no learning disabilities are inappropriately supported and end up in a position perhaps where they can't engage with schools. But it might be that that's perhaps something we could look at, or the future committee would look at realistically on this question. So I think in this circumstances, the agreement of the committee is that we would want to initially write to the organisation support people with autism to reflect what's been said here and what's said in the petition, urge the petitioner to respond to, but that we recognise that maybe we need to explore further with the Scottish Government. What they have at first asserted as being the case may not actually be what people's experience of it are. I wonder if there's any last comments that Alexander Burnett wants to make before we move on.
No, convener, just to say I'm extremely grateful to the committee for keeping this open, and delighted with the route that they're going down on this petition. Thank you very much.
Okay, in that case, thank you very much too for your attendance. If we can now move to the second new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1839, Review Maternity Models in Remote and Rural Areas, lodged by Maria Aitken on behalf of Caithness Health Action Team. The petition calls the Scottish Government to ask all relevant health boards to review their maternity model to ensure that it meets the needs of remote and rural communities. In its submission, the Scottish Government explains that it is currently discussing changes in rural service provision and arrangements for obstetrics transfers across Scotland. Furthermore, a maternity transport expert working group has been convened to develop a tool to assist clinicians in the decision-making process. The Scottish Government highlights that NHS Highland is part of the Best Start North steering group, which was set up to review maternity and neonatal services across NHS Shetland, NHS Orkney, NHS Highland and NHS Grampian. Inclusive of this programme of work, NHS Highland is undertaking a review of its perinatal mental health service, and with Scottish Government investment will be looking to expand its current perinatal mental health service provision. The petitioner believes the centralisation of maternity services, when there is a distance of over 100 miles to the nearest service, has a significant negative effect on perinatal mental health for mothers, their unborn babies and children left separated from their main caregiver when mother and father are miles away. And I should note that Rhoda Grant is here for this petition, and I'm going to call her first. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, convener, and I appreciate you calling me again. I think this is the fourth petition I'm speaking to today, so I appreciate your forbearance. This is a really important petition, and I think the petitioner has made her case well. I mean, I've been involved for a number of years with concerns that mothers have about the maternity services in Caithness, and in February the year before last, so February 2019, I raised the issue at First Minister's questions about twins that were born. One was born in Golspie and one was born in Inverness. Seems like a horrendous circumstance to be in labour and give birth. I mean, the staff available on that night really made sure that nothing wrong happened and there was a safe delivery. But you can just imagine the stress that that causes when you are on a land ambulance travelling over 100 miles in labour, knowing that there are complications and that you need at a hospital where there are obstetricians. And so I have always said, when they changed Caithness from an obstetrics-led maternity unit to a midwife-led maternity unit, that they should also do a risk assessment on the transfer journeys to Raidmore if anything happened that was a complication. I've looked at this at some length, especially after the case that I cited, and it appears that if a woman is in labour, helicopter transport is not really an option, because a helicopter is just an unsuitable environment to give birth because of the movement, because of the space and the like. Now, I've also pursued the Scots Star service because this is a service run by the Scottish Ambulance Service, which flies specialists to the area of need, and they can also have retrieval teams and they can fly people back to the specialist units. But I've been pursuing whether or not that I know they deal with paediatrics, but that they could deal with obstetrics as well and fly out obstetricians to places like Caithness General, rather than expecting the mum to travel 100 miles in the back of an ambulance with no safe delivery space in between General, Raidmore Hospital and Inverness. So I believe that the Scottish Government need to, as I know that they're looking at Best Start, but the trouble is that this work has been stalled and there has been no outcome forthcoming. And the difficulty is this has gone on for a number of years, and one of the added complications is that now mums, knowing that there could be complications, there might be, are opting for elective caesareans. Now, a caesarean is a major operation, but that is the only way they can deal with family constraints. Other children are looked after while they are booked in, so that they have a time and a date when they will have to go to Inverness and make suitable arrangements. Now, that's not safe either, having major surgery, because you can't access obstetric services on your doorstep. So I'd urge the committee to take this seriously, get in touch with the government, put some speed around the Best Start assessment, and make sure that there are the specialists available that can fly out to those mums, rather than put somebody in labour in the back of an ambulance without any realistic knowledge of whether they will be giving birth in the back of an ambulance on the road or whether they will reach their destination. And there have been stories of mums reaching Raidmore in the back of an ambulance in labour and being told there is no room and having to go on further to Aberdeen, which is totally unacceptable. So this is a serious petition and needs a serious.
Okay, thank you very much. I should indicate that Edward Mountain MSP has asked that we place on record his support for this petition. He can't attend as he's convening the Rural Affairs Committee, so that is something that people can bear in mind. Can I call Tom Mason?
The treatment of newborns and mothers and so on in rural areas is a very important issue, and some serious thought has to be put into place to make sure that all eventualities are covered if things going wrong, and a great deal amount of planning and detail needs to be sorted through. And if a review is taking place, then we do need a timescale on this, because I can remember 2 years ago asking a question of the Minister in terms of Fresh Start, and I didn't get a very satisfactory answer to some of my questions. So I think writing to the Scottish Government again to see what the timescale is for this review, and make sure that all the bases are fully covered to the satisfaction of the public. I mean, the anxiety that must be experienced by potential mothers in rural areas sometimes must be quite terrifying. Fortunately, being a man, I don't have to go through that process, and lucky for it, I guess. But I do worry that there are problems in certain places which can be avoided. I mean, they're always but natural birth is always a risk. But I think we can cover most of the risk much more satisfactorily than we do. So keeping it open, wanting to get some timescale on the review, and make sure we get the right answers, and then we can take a view once we've got those answers from government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail Roberts.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, I mean, I am absolutely supportive of the petition. In the round, I agree that all health boards and organisations should consider the best services for local need. Nobody wants to send pregnant women 100 miles to give birth, and I would love to see anything provided locally that, if there is a different way to do it, and I said this right at the start, I supported the recommendations in the review because I'm not a medical expert. The model had to change. There's one thing that I am going to point out about the petition. The fact that the word, when it says that the review deemed the current model unsafe, and that model was obstetricians without paediatrics. It was an unsafe model because a baby died, and the review then also pointed out that due to the model there could have been other babies that died that may have been saved. So to put the word unsafe in inverted commas in this petition, I think does a great disservice to the families that have suffered due to this model and welcomed the reconfiguration to CMU. I think that we have to take into account that, you know, we have moved on since this configuration was made. This started in 2016, and there has been a lot of progress both within the community and within NHS Highland. It's not perfect, nothing is. Nobody says that anything is risk-free. And you know, as I said right at the start, I absolutely agree that services provided anywhere in urban, rural, island communities should be what is appropriate for that community. The things that Rhoda Grant is suggesting, I'm absolutely content to write to the Scottish Government to find out if any of those would be possible. I am open to you know, bringing on anything from other countries to try and make this less risky, if you want to use that word. And you know, I am absolutely alive to all the issues that have come up and probably will continue to come up. But I do think that there is a lot of work. We've got local councillors working with the NHS. Rhoda Grant, Edward Mountain obviously have you know, contact regularly with NHS Highland, as do I, and other elected members. So I agree that we should write to the Scottish Government to ask for an update on the maternity working group. And as Tom Mason suggested, the Best Start stuff, you know, you also said in your opening remarks that NHS Highland are undertaking a review of their perinatal mental health services, which is great. You know, so there is work ongoing, and you know, I think that there's a lot of feeling sometimes that, you know, just because we're so far north, we've kind of been left behind, and it's all been centralised in Inverness, and you know, as opposed to the High-All one that we discussed before, which I didn't agree with, the centralisation thing. This decision hasn't been made just so that everybody can go to Inverness to give birth. You know, this decision was made because of a massive safety issue, and we need to keep that in mind, but open to suggestions about how we make it better, of course. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, convener. Yes, I agree we should write to the Scottish Government on the points that have already been raised by my colleagues. I support all that's been said, and I think the question about services must be appropriate to each community to minimise risk, but obviously safety is foremost and paramount to that. And yes, it's a question of centres of excellence, which I know that's a policy in Scotland, which we have also in the central region. But nevertheless, there's still delivery of care in our communities, and that's terribly important. We mustn't lose sight of that. But obviously, the very best care for our expectant mothers in every way, shape, or possible, and avoiding these 100-mile or anything like that distances to travel to give birth. So I would support the fact that we write the Scottish Government to confirm the timescales that will be implemented in the conclusion of the discussion, and also the work and the outcome of the work of the Maternity Transport Export Working Group as well. So I would support that to remain open to get clarification and feedback from that. Thank you.
David Torrance.
Convener, I'm happy to go for recommendations of my committee members. Thank you very much.
Okay, in the interest of time, since we're under a bit of pressure now, I'm not going to go back to Rhoda Grant because I think people have responded to what she was saying, and that we should write to the Scottish Government, and the issues that we'd be highlighting be ones that reflected in what she has had to say, and what other committee members have had to say. And I think, you know, the point that Gail Ross makes is the challenging one, which is when is centralisation for its own sake, and when is it necessary? We had this argument in Glasgow around acute services, when people wanted, you know, who felt that the hospital was too far away when it was the other side of the city. So that is also an issue hugely amplified in remote and rural and fragile communities. But we are noting the support of Rhoda Grant and Edward Mountain, and that we would be writing to the Scottish Government in the terms that have been described. If we can now move on, and I would thank Rhoda Grant for her attendance. I'm not sure if she's engaged in any more of them, I wouldn't be surprised. If we move on to the next new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1840, addressing racism in Scottish education, lodged by Deborah Kayembe on behalf of the Freedom Walk. The petition calls on the Scottish Government urgently to address racism in the Scottish education system by implementing anti-racist education in the classroom, delivering anti-racist training for all school staff, and recording, monitoring and addressing racist incidents in schools. Submissions have been received from the Scottish Government and the petitioner. The Scottish Government submission notes that teachers are expected at all stages of their careers to demonstrate professional values and personal commitment to social justice and cultural diversity by engaging learners in real-world issues. It also advises that the National Framework for Inclusion has been designed to ensure that all teachers are appropriately guided and supported throughout their careers towards gaining the required knowledge and understanding of inclusive education. The petitioner's submission states, quote, "There is nothing within the Scottish Government response that demonstrates that anti-racist training is being provided to qualified teachers in a consistent and mandatory way." And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action, and I'm going to call Gail Ross.
Thanks. I found this one really quite interesting again, and I know that we've dealt with ones on a similar kind of vein. We do have a lot of submissions from organisations. I mean, we've got stuff about the EIS, we've got stuff about Education Scotland, we've got the Respect for All anti-bullying policy, which I was actually part of as part of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee of the Parliament that informed that new policy when we did our bullying in schools inquiry, which was a big eye-opener actually. I think, though, it's another situation, and we've had this again with many petitions, where you get the official line and then the petitioner comes back with an equally interesting couple of points. So I think that we should write back again to the Scottish Government, just seeking some clarity on the points that the petitioner has raised about, you know, the anti-racist stuff. I mean, you know, there is a kind of difference about promoting diversity, but being anti-racist, as has been pointed out. So I would be interested to seek further views I think it's too important to just close straight away. So that would be my course of action. Thank you.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I agree entirely what Go Ross has said previously, and I would agree that we write the Scottish Government to seek its further views on this matter.
Okay, thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Like my colleagues, I'm quite happy to write to the Scottish Government just to seek views on the submission by petitioner.
Okay, thank you. Tom Mason.
The views of government on these issues, I think it's appropriate. So if we do that, I'll agree. That would be best.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is a particular issue which is about not so much what teachers teach. So I think the other petitions were quite a lot about teaching history other than what would be regarded as mainstream history that excluded the experience of a range of groups of people. This specifically talks about training for teachers, and whether this is consistent and mandatory. And I think our letter should include that as well. But I think that's agreed in terms of how we take that one forward. If we can now move to the final new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1841, allow a designated visitor into care homes, lodged by Natasha Hamilton on behalf of Care Home Relatives Scotland. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to allow a designated visitor into care homes to support loved ones. The Scottish Government submission explains that given the significantly higher risks that COVID-19 poses for care home residents, it has been necessary to pursue a different relaxation of the restrictions compared to the general population. It stresses, however, that it must strike a balance between the risk posed by COVID-19 and the impact family visits have on the well-being of residents. The Scottish Government explains that guidance has regularly been updated to reflect new evidence and with a view to opening up more opportunities for families and friends to visit, including guidance from 3rd December, specifically aimed to help care homes support visiting over the Christmas and New Year period. The Scottish Government highlights that it is introducing lateral flow testing to care homes, which will be offered to designated visitors on the day of their visit. These were introduced in 14 early adopted care homes across 5 local authority areas last week, and key learning will be used from this to inform the wider rollout. Lateral flow testing kits will start to be delivered to all care homes this week. Where care homes are unable to make use of these kits, PCR testing of visitors will be available when necessary to facilitate visiting over the Christmas and New Year period. The Scottish Government further highlights care homes will now be closed to new admissions and visitors for 14 rather than 28 days following an outbreak, and this will avoid long periods when care homes are closed to visitors. Since the meeting papers were published, we have received a written submission from the petitioner. In it, she states that there is currently a postcode lottery surrounding visiting arrangements in care homes, and explains that the goal of the petition is to introduce legislation to guarantee that care home residents will never be isolated from family or friends for such a long period. I should also note that Monica Lennon, MSP, had hoped to be able to be here for this petition, but was unable to do so because of a clash of diary commitments. I'd be interested in what other members think we can do in this. I do think it's a huge issue. I think it's an issue that is shifting over time. I think the consequences for families and for their loved ones are massive, but we also recognise the issue of risk. I wonder whether even when the Scottish Government is providing guidance that things can move on, in fact, individual care homes have been care averse because, or risk averse rather, because perhaps they haven't got access to the testing, they haven't got access to proper PPE or whatever it might be. So there's a question for us, what can we do? But it does feel to me that this is a really important issue, and simply to close it without any further action would perhaps to minimise the seriousness of the issue more generally, and it might be that the Scottish Government has more that it can say to us, particularly about this last point, which is that the petitioner is looking for legislation that guarantees in the future, your future plan to make sure this doesn't happen again, even in extreme circumstances. So that bit I found interesting. It was almost like having learned from this, not just what do we do short term, but what maybe we could be thinking about doing long term, should there be such a crisis again in the future. But I'm going to call Maurice Corey.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I just want to declare I'm a member of the COVID committee, which scrutinises the government's legislation coming forward on a weekly basis. And this is an issue that is raised very often within our committee, and we discuss this with the public health team of the Scottish Government and Scottish Government ministers as well. No, I think this is something we've learned a lot from this particular pandemic that's been going on with COVID. And I think that the point about future regulations, I think something could be devolved in that. I'm certainly against closing this petition, and I think we need to take more action on it. And I would call on the Scottish Government to give us more information about timescales, what they're developing, what the plan is, because from my experience on the COVID committee, when we do question them and do interrogate them, as it were, as scrutinise the work, the legislation, there is certainly a lot more that we can get out of what the government are thinking and what they're doing. So I would recommend that we write to the Scottish Government, ask them the plans and the way forward. But I would say thank you to, as I say, to the petitioner for bringing this very important petition forward. And yes, progress is being made. There's no doubt about it. I can say that from my position on the COVID committee. And there's some positive ways going. The lateral flow testing is working through, and obviously we're reducing the reduction of the 14 days of closure. The 14 days of closure from 28 is welcome as well. But there's still a lot we can find out, and I would ask that we ask the right to the Scottish Government and seek more information, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. This is a very emotional petition, and it affects not only the relatives and the family members, but the individuals in the care homes. I have been in contact with a few care homes in my area about visiting for the relatives, and the big issue that comes across is the risk to their other residents and to their duty of care to their staff. The consequences of letting people visit. And I know the Scottish Government's working to try and find ways and means of doing this, but I'd like my fellow petitioners, I think we should write to the Scottish Government, ask them a timescale for this and what they have in mind. But after that, can we take this petition anywhere else? Do we have the time to do it? This is a subject that's changing all the time. So I'm in mind to close the petition under Rule 55.7 of Standing Orders once we write to the Scottish Government to get information back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom Mason.
Thank you, Convener. I think we should keep this open because the issues here are very important. I think that some of the problems we've had up to now is that there was no initial framework for sorting all this out. But in hindsight, we were dealing with something nobody knew what to do. I think as we move forward, we can't go. We must assume that there will be similar problems occurring in the future, but from a different virus or different situation. But a legal and transparent framework is necessary to put in place. What that should be, I have no idea at this stage. And I think we should try and get out of the government what plans are for reviewing what's being done, how it's being done, when the framework was put in place, what transparency is there, what role Parliament is, what role of experts is, and so on. So there's a whole lot of issues, and I think the petitioner has quite rightly started the ball rolling on this, and I think we should keep this open where we can, and it should continue on. Even if we don't, as a committee in this Parliament, should be continued on in the next Parliament until we get this whole situation sorted through, so we don't go through the same agony that this country has gone through this time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail Ross.
Thanks, Convener. I think that Maurice Corey made a really important point right at the start. If this, and I'm just throwing this out there, I hadn't thought of it before, if this is being covered by the COVID committee, how how much added value do we add by pursuing it, and would it result in a duplication of work? So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not saying that, you know, we shouldn't do it just because another committee are doing it. I think that we also have to take into account not just testing in care homes, the fact that we've got a vaccine now and it's being given to care home residents and staff, you know, right at the top of the list. In addition to writing to the Minister, we could also write to Donald McCaskill from the care home, the organisation that represents the care homes, just to maybe ask if, and I know it's difficult with asking for timetables and stuff because we don't know when the next batch of the vaccine, or, you know, when another vaccine is going to be approved, and obviously when that happens it'll make things, it'll change and make things a whole lot easier. Not that it's an easy process anyway, don't get me wrong in that statement. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy enough to write to the Minister and to Mr McCaskill. I wonder if maybe we should also write to the COVID committee just to let them know what we're doing as a courtesy, just because that's what they cover. But again, open to suggestions. Thanks.
Okay, I think we are in a dilemma here, because this is one of these petitions where things are moving so fast and we're running out of time, but we want to make clear that we think this is a really important issue. And I wonder whether we should be flagging up to the COVID committee. We're making it very clear we think these are fundamental issues that need to be addressed. That I'm on the horns of the dilemma myself here, but whether we keep it open, because the immediate issue is about how do we make sure that this is sorted and that it's you know, something government is taking seriously. So it may be that what we should do is be writing Scottish Government, flagging it up to the COVID committee, but recognising the bulk of the work around what has been asked for in this petition, which is make sure this never happens again, is something that will not be addressed before the end of March, but it would be the very useful subject of a petition come the new Parliament. So it's to underline and underscore the seriousness of this, flag it up to the COVID committee that there are questions that should be asked. We then have to decide as a committee, does that mean that the best way in which the Public Petitions Committee could focus on addressing this would be round the issue of legislation, never again, and that would be part of perhaps a new petition in the new term. I see Maurice Corrie was wanting to come in, but I would be interested in views around the dilemma that I have identified. Maurice?
Yeah, Convener, hi. Thank you very much. Yes, just to come back on the point that Gail and yourself have made. Yes, I mean, we would welcome anything from this committee in relation to this particular petition, but we're a reactive committee. In other words, we react to the regulations presented to us weekly by the Scottish Government as presented, and then we scrutinise on that. But obviously, we can ask the questions from time to time. So I still think it's worthwhile putting in a request, a point that we've got this petition running with us here in this committee, because that would be very helpful and would also help us formulate some of our ideas and questioning that we would take forward in scrutiny. And maybe the clerking teams could liaise on that in relation to that. I put it back to you, Convener, and I certainly think that, yeah, we would accept that.
Okay, I think that in all fairness, we do want as a committee to say that this is a serious issue, that it's not been resolved. It maybe we should be writing to Donald McCaskill, who represents care homes, just to get a sense of why would is there a resistance from them? And I think the other organisation was the Coalition of Care Providers. I think we might want to write to them, see if there's an issue around that. Flag it up to the COVID committee, but be very honest with the petitioner that there's going to be a limit to what we can do, not because we don't think it's an important issue, but because while a lot of these things are moving fast, the parliamentary time is running out, and it may be that in our legacy paper we would be recommending looking at this further, or, as I've already suggested, the petitioner may want specifically to look at a petition which addresses the issue at that point, which would be around legislation, never again, how do we deal with these circumstances so that in the middle of the emergency that was, there's, in my view, quite evident that the impact in care homes was not fully appreciated or realised. And I wonder if members would agree that we would not close it immediately. We would write to the Scottish Government and the other groups who have suggested, flag it up to the COVID committee, but be very alive to the fact that the substance of this petition is not going to be addressed before March, which is future-proofing policy around what we do in pandemics or in crisis of any sort. In fact, I wonder if people would agree that that might be the best way forward. Yeah, I think we have agreement on that, and we recognise that this has been very important discussion, and indeed that we've had a very substantial discussion over a whole range of petitions today. I want to thank the clerks, broadcasting team, and our visitors, of whom there seem to be quite a number this week, and to members themselves, and just to remind us that we're now moving into private session and people need to log back onto Teams in order for that discussion to take place. Thanks very much, and I'll therefore move into the meeting into private.